somewhere tonight. The hands of an old person are resting open on a blanket, palms up. Fingers uncurled, the way hands rest when they have finally stopped grasping. Not because they gave up, because they learned. There is a particular quality of stillness that only comes after many seasons. You can hear it sometimes in the voice of someone very old, not the silence of someone who has nothing left to say, but the silence of someone who has stopped needing to say it. A silence that has weight, that has history inside it, that is, in its own quiet way, a kind of arrival. Tonight, you are allowed to rest in that kind of stillness. Whether you are young or old, or somewhere in the middle of a life that has asked more of you than you expected tonight, this stillness is yours. Maybe you are lying here carrying something about time, a feeling that you have not done enough, become enough, understood enough. Maybe you are watching your own body change and you are not quite sure how to make peace with what you see. Maybe someone you love is aging, and their fragility is becoming your own private grief. Or maybe you are simply tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has been paying close attention to this life for a long time. All of that is welcome here. All of it is understood. If you feel like it, leave one word in the comments. Just one word for what tonight feels like from the inside. No explanation needed. I am genuinely curious what word comes first. I have been sitting with these particular stories for a long time, longer than I expected to. Something about the way these masters aged not despite their wisdom, but through it, keeps drawing me back. I wanted to find the right way to share them with you. Tonight, we will travel through 6 Buddhist traditions: the Thai Forest tradition, Japanese Soto Zen, Korean Seon, Vietnamese Thiền Trúc Lâm, Tibetan Nyingma Dzogchen, and the Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka, each of which has preserved something rare, the wisdom of masters who did not merely grow old, but who learned to receive old age as the final and perhaps deepest teaching of their lives. These stories are contemplative in nature, not medical or therapeutic advice. Let your body find whatever position asks the least of it tonight. Let your eyes, if they are not already closed, drift gently shut. Feel the weight of your head against whatever is holding it. Feel your shoulders settling slightly with each breath, not because you are trying to relax them, but simply because the breath, when you stop interrupting it, knows how to carry the body downward on its own. You have arrived somewhere tonight. Let that be enough. In the northeastern corner of Thailand, where the dry season turns the red earth to a fine powder that coats sandals and robes alike, and where the rains, when they come, smell of iron and something green rising from very deep in the ground, there was a forest monastery that had grown slowly over 3 decades from a single, hand-cleared grove into something the surrounding villages had long since stopped trying to explain to outsiders. They called it simply the forest. Its formal name was Wat Nong Pa Pong, the monastery of the dense forest pond, and by the year 1982, it had become the kind of place that people traveled extraordinary distances to reach. Not because anything extraordinary was advertised there, but because something about the particular quality of stillness the place held could not quite be found anywhere else. There were by then several hundred monks resident at any one time. Their meditation huts, scattered among the teak and rain trees, on paths worn smooth by 10,000 barefoot mornings. There was a main hall whose roof curved upward at the eaves in the Thai way, as if the building itself were caught mid-bow. There were vegetable gardens, tended at dawn, a well that had been dug by hand 40 years earlier and still ran cold and clear. A large bell, whose sound carried through the forest each morning at 3:30 and could be heard on quiet nights from the nearest village a kilometer away. And at the center of all of it, not physically at the center, but at the center in the way that certain people are the center of a room, even when they are standing quietly near the wall, there was a monk named Ajahn Chah. He had been born in 1918, the third child of a rice farming family in a village not far from the monastery he would one day build. He had ordained as a novice at 9, left to help his family farm, returned to full ordination at 20, studied Buddhist texts until he grew restless with study, then taken up the life of a wandering forest monk at the age of 28, sleeping in jungles, in caves, in cremation grounds, practicing in the way the Buddha had practiced, in the direct company of impermanence. For 7 years, he had walked across Thailand, sleeping under his umbrella tent in tiger-inhabited forests, sitting with dying people in village hospitals, learning from his own body what no sutra could teach him about the nature of sensation and its passing. He had settled eventually in a fever-ridden, cobra-inhabited grove near his home village, the grove everyone else had avoided, and built a monastery there. Slowly, over years, from donated wood and bamboo and the labor of monks who came because they had heard something about a teacher in a haunted forest who taught in a way that made the Dhamma feel like something you had always known and somehow forgotten. By the year 1982, Ajahn Chah was 64 years old. His face had the quality that very still water sometimes has a surface that showed you the sky above it while concealing depths you could not easily measure. His teaching style was famous for its combination of precision and humor. He could demolish a complicated piece of philosophical ego construction with a single story about a water buffalo or a leaking roof, and leave his students feeling not diminished but somehow lighter, as if something they had been carrying without knowing it had been quietly removed from their hands. But that year, his body was beginning to ask different questions. It had started as tiredness, the kind that does not lift with a night's sleep or a morning's rest. Then a heaviness in the legs, a slight drag in the right foot. The monastery's senior monks noticed it first, the way people who love someone notice things before that person is ready to say them aloud. Then the abbot of a nearby temple who had some medical training. Then, eventually, a doctor brought quietly from Ubon Ratchathani city who used words like circulation and nerve involvement and spoke, afterward, to the senior monks privately. Diabetes. Complicated. Surgery would likely be needed. The timeline was unclear, but the direction was not. In the year that followed this conversation, Ajahn Chah would undergo brain surgery to try to relieve the pressure building from the diabetes-related complications. In the years after that, the surgery's effects would be partial at best. By 1983, he would lose the ability to speak. The last 10 years of Ajahn Chah's life, from his 65th year to his 73rd, would be spent entirely bedridden in a specially built room at the monastery, tended by his disciples, visited by thousands of practitioners from across the world, present in a way that required no words at all. But on this particular morning in 1982, none of that had arrived yet. On this particular morning, a young monk named Somchai was walking the path between the kitchen buildings and the main hall, carrying a large clay water jug that was slightly heavier than his arms preferred. Navigating the exposed root of a teak tree, he crossed twice each day and somehow still occasionally forgot to account for, and turning over a question that had been sitting in him for 3 weeks without being any closer to resolution. Somchai was 24 years old. He had come to Wat Nong Pa Pong from a family in Bangkok where his father ran a hardware import business, counted his days in shipping invoices, and had asked twice, with decreasing hopefulness, whether Somchai was truly certain about this. Somchai had said yes both times. His father had gone quiet in the way of people who have run out of arguments but whose uncertainty continues. His mother had packed dried mango and said nothing further. That had been 2 years ago. In those 2 years, Somchai had learned to build a cooking fire in wet weather, had memorized the Pali Suttas through the 4th chapter, had learned to sit in meditation for 4 hours without his body sending urgent complaints to his attention, and had developed the slightly unfocused quality of gaze that marks young monks who are spending the majority of their waking hours watching the arising and passing of their own internal weather. By most measures, he was doing well. But the question would not leave him. It was not a large question, the way questions about enlightenment or the nature of consciousness are large. It was specific, quietly specific, the way a splinter is quiet and specific. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier when Somchai had been crossing the main courtyard just after the 5 o'clock bell and had seen Ajan Cha walking not quickly, as he had always walked in the stories the older monks told. Not with the decisive, unhurried stride of someone who had decided not to hurry for entirely different reasons than everyone else, but walking slowly, with a slight tilt, his right hand trailing along the wall of the Sala building as he moved. That particular quality of the hand against the wall, not grasping, not leaning hard, just touching as if checking that the wall was still there, or as if offering the wall a small gratitude for continuing to be solid in a world that was, by degrees, becoming less so. Something had tightened in Somchai's chest, and it had not fully released since. He had turned the tightening over in his mind during sitting periods. He had noticed it arising during chanting. He had tried to observe it with the even, non-attached attention the teaching described, and found, to his frustration, that what he mostly felt was the tightening, and that observing it with equanimity was considerably easier in theory than in the early morning, with the sound of a bell fading and a teacher walking slowly along a familiar wall. The question at the center of the tightening was this: was what he felt fear of loss? And if it was that a sign that he was too attached? Or was it a sign that he was paying attention? And was there a difference? He was still turning this over, and was approximately halfway through the process of negotiating the exposed teak root, when he rounded the corner of the kitchen building and came close enough that he had to step sideways quickly to walking directly into Ajahn Chah, who was standing in the shade of a large teak tree looking at the quality of light coming through the canopy with the unconcerned expression of someone who has no particular plans for the next hour and is finding this entirely agreeable. The water jug tilted. Water sloshed over the rim and landed on the red dust between them. Somchai caught the jug before more spilled and stood very still, mortified. Ajan Cha looked at the wet patch in the dust, then at Somchai's face, then, briefly, at the jug. "Careful," he said, mildly, the way one might note that it looks like rain. "I'm sorry, Luangpur. I wasn't watching where I was." "You were thinking," Ajahn Chah said. Not an accusation. A simple observation, offered with the same mild interest, one might note the direction of a breeze. "Yes, Luangpur," loudly, said Ajahn Chah, and the corner of his eyes moved slightly. This was how he smiled. Somchai set the water jug carefully at the base of the teak tree. He straightened. The morning air smelled of wood smoke from the kitchen fires and of the particular scent of damp earth that the night's humidity had coaxed from the red clay paths. Somewhere on the other side of the tree line, A bird was repeating a single melodic phrase with the patience of something that has never believed in urgency. Somchai had spoken with Ajahn Chah before. In the brief and oblique exchanges that characterized the teacher's relationship with new monks, a correction offered during morning work, a short instruction about posture. Once, a quietly devastating 3-sentence observation about Somchai's tendency to confuse diligence with strain, but he had never asked a direct question. The question he carried had seemed, each time he considered bringing it forward, too small, too personal, too much the question of someone who was perhaps paying attention to the wrong thing. Standing now in the shade of the teak tree, the question felt different. Not smaller, just the only question he actually had. "Luangpor," he said. "May I ask you something?" A small gesture. "Go ahead. I have been watching you," Somchai said, aware this might be forward, but finding he could not find a less direct way into it. "In the mornings, walking, and I noticed that it is harder than it was. The walking." He paused. "When I noticed this, something in me," he looked for the right word, contracts. "A tightening. And I have been trying to understand if this tightening is attachment, if it means I am holding too strongly to something that belongs to impermanence, or if it is simply what it feels like to see clearly. And I cannot tell the difference." He stopped. The bird continued its phrase outside the tree line. Inside the kitchen building behind them, a pot was moved across a stone surface with a sound that was very ordinary and very present. Ajan Cha was quiet. Not the quiet of someone formulating a response, but the quiet of someone who has already arrived at the place the question is trying to reach and is simply waiting to see if the questioner would like company on the walk there. He looked down at the water jug at the base of the tree. "When water spills from a jug," he said, "does the jug become less of a jug?" Somchai considered this carefully. "No, Luangpur. And when the jug cracks," Ajan Cha said, "when it develops a line along the side." Here he drew a finger along an invisible seam and begins to let small amounts of water seep through. "Does the space inside become smaller?" "No. And when the jug finally breaks entirely, when it falls from someone's hands, let us say, and becomes pieces on the ground, what becomes of the space that was inside it?" Somchai had heard teachings in this direction before. In the suttas, in explanations other monks had offered. He knew the shape of the answer the teaching was reaching toward. But Ajahn Chah was looking at him with the specific quality of attention that made clear he was not asking for the correct answer. He was asking what Somchai actually, bodily, in the middle of his own chest, understood. The bird, outside the tree line, fell silent for a moment, as if also curious. "It returns," Somchai said slowly, "to the space around it, to the larger space." Ajahn Chah looked at the jug again. And were they ever truly separated, the space inside the jug and the space that the jug was sitting in the middle of? Something moved in Somchai's chest then. Not dramatically, not with any great heat. More the way a tightly held breath releases a slow, particular easing that moves from the sternum outward and does not announce itself. The space inside the jug and the space outside it. Were they ever two different things? "The body changes," Ajahn Chah said. He extended his right hand out and looked at it for a moment, the slight thickening at the knuckles, the skin moving more loosely over the bones than it once had. The particular geography of 64 years of forest living and sitting still and walking barefoot on uneven ground. He looked at it with what appeared to be genuine, uncomplicated interest. Then he let it fall back to his side. This body has carried me for 64 years. It walked for 7 years through forests where cobras slept under the roots of trees. It sat through monsoons and through the dry season's particular heat. It bowed 10,000 mornings. It has served very well. He paused. Now it is beginning to ask to slow down. To ask for certain kinds of help it did not used to require. He looked at Somchai. I find I have no argument with it. But Luang Por Somchai stopped himself. Say it, Ajan Cha said. How do you not? Somchai searched for words that would not sound like complaint or accusation. Resist. How is it possible to not resist something like that? Ajan Cha was quiet for a moment. A monk passed at a distance, carrying a broom, not looking their direction. Have you ever tried to push the river back? Ajahn Chah asked. No. It's very tiring, Ajahn Chah said. Even if you push with both hands, even if you push with great determination, the river does not take this personally. It simply continues. The slight movement in the corner of his eyes again. I have been in this forest for 28 years. I have watched many monsoons arrive and many dry seasons follow them. I have watched the forest burn in 1976 and grow back. I have watched students come here with great confusion and leave a little less confused. And I have watched students come with great certainty and leave a little less certain, which is often more useful. And I have watched my own body do what bodies do, which is change. Always change. Without asking permission. Without consulting anyone's preferences about the timeline. He paused. Your fear, he said finally, is not wrong. It is not a failure of practice. It is the fear of someone who loves something and has the honesty to know that things change. That is not too much attachment. That is, he seemed to be choosing carefully eyes that are clean. Eyes that have not decided in advance what they are willing to see. He reached down and picked up the water jug from the base of the teak tree. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, or perhaps feeling something about its weight. Something that Somchai would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. Then he handed it back. Carry it carefully, he said. Not because you are afraid to spill it, because you are paying attention to what is in your hands. He turned and continued across the courtyard. His gait was slightly uneven. His right hand moved occasionally to touch the familiar surface's walls, posts, the smooth bark of a tree he passed, and each touch looked less like steadying and more like greeting, as if the monastery itself were an old friend whose elbow he was briefly, affectionately taking. Somchai stood at the base of the teak tree holding the water jug. The question had not disappeared, but it had changed its form. It had stopped being something he needed to resolve and become something he was simply, quietly, present with the way he was present with the weight of the jug, the way he was present with the morning air cooling his wrists, the way he was present with the sound of the bell still faintly ringing somewhere in the bowl of his memory. In the years that followed, Somchai thought about that morning often. He thought about it when Ajahn Chah's health declined further and the surgery came and brought its partial relief and its new limitations. He thought about it during the long years when he and the other monks gathered each morning in the room where their teacher lay offering incense, chanting the suttas, tending to a presence that no longer spoke and yet somehow continued, unmistakably, to teach. He thought about it when visitors came from across the world scholars and abbots and quiet lay people who had read one of Ajahn Chah's translated books and travelled thousands of kilometers to sit in that room for 30 minutes, and who left with something that did not have a name in any language Somchai knew. What he returned to, each time, was not a doctrine. It was an image. A hand extended in the morning light, looking at itself with uncomplicated interest. Skin loosening over the knuckles. 64 years of living, legible in the geography of a palm. And then the hand falling back, gently, without drama, without resistance, without the performance of acceptance, which is its own form of resistance, dressed in better clothing. Just the hand, and then the hand at rest. In the Thai forest tradition, there is a teaching that Ajahn Chah offered many times in many forms throughout his life. He offered it to the elderly lay disciple who came to him near the end of her life, asking what she should do with the fear. He offered it in forest clearings and in monastery halls, and in the small practical vocabulary of a man who trusted experience more than theory. The teaching does not ask you to feel good about change. It does not ask you to be grateful for illness or loss, or the slow narrowing of a body's range. It asks only that you notice clearly, without the interference of what you wish were true, that what you are is not the water inside the jug, that what you are has no walls, that the space which held all those years of practice and love and suffering and understanding and humor and sitting in the dark before the 3:30 bell, that space did not begin with the body, and it will not end with it. Ajahn Chah spent his final 10 years in silence, tended by those who loved him. He died on the 16th of January, 1992. He was 73 years old. More than 1 million people attended his funeral, including the King and Queen of Thailand. The monks who had cared for him through those last 10 years say that the room where he rested always had a quality of stillness they could not explain, not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of something fully, completely, unutterably present. The jug had been set down. The space, as it turned out, had always been the larger space. And as that understanding settles in you, not as an idea to be grasped, but as something to be rested in, let your breath come a little more slowly. Let the shoulders fall. Let the chest soften just slightly around whatever it is holding. If you drift off here, that is exactly right. You don't need to stay awake to receive what these stories are offering. Let your body choose when it is ready to go. The breath comes. The breath goes. The space between them is always there. We travel now to a small mountain in Japan, where an old man lived alone in a hut smaller than most people's closets, played with children in the snow, wrote poems that have lasted 200 years, and learned in his final winter something about how to be held. In the snow country of Echigo province, on the northwestern coast of Japan, where the Sea of Japan pushes cold air inland across flat coastal plains, and where winter does not arrive gradually, but all at once, where one morning the sky is simply a different color, and by afternoon the mountain paths have vanished, and the world has contracted into a single, unbroken, almost merciful whiteness. There was a small hut on the grounds of a temple called Kokujoji that a monk named Ryokan had been living in for 36 years. The hut was called Gogoen. The name meant, approximately, the hut of the reclining cow, though Ryokan himself had never explained this choice to anyone's satisfaction, and those who loved him had long since stopped expecting his choices to resolve into explanation. It was approximately 3 tatami mats in size. standing in the center of it with your arms extended. You could touch both side walls simultaneously. Its roof admitted rain in certain kinds of downpour. Its walls, repaired many times over the years with varying degrees of thoroughness, admitted the winter cold through gaps that Ryokan had never permanently sealed, perhaps because each autumn he suspected he might not stay for another winter, and each spring found him still present, still alive, still capable of mild surprise at his own continuation. Inside the hut there was a sleeping mat rolled against one wall, a small clay brazier for warmth, which on the coldest nights was not quite sufficient, but which Ryokan had long since stopped resenting. An inkstone and a set of brushes arranged on a low table with more care than anything else in the room, more care than the mat, more care than the brazier, more care than the single robe hanging from a peg near the door. A stack of papers, which grew through the autumn months and diminished in winter when visitors came and admired something he had written and he gave it away, which he did freely, without keeping track. A single bowl, old enough that its glaze had worn to something softer than glaze, a kind of matte warmth that catches light differently than new things do. And on the shelf above the sleeping mat, a small wooden figure of the Buddha that had lost most of its lacquer over the years. Its surface now the bare warm color of old cedar, which Ryokan found more beautiful than it had been when it was finished. He had come to Gyeongheo in his early 30s. After 12 years of training at the Entsuji monastery in Tamashima under the Soto Zen master Kokusen, Kokusen had recognized something in Ryokan had given him the Inca, the seal of transmission, the confirmation that his understanding was complete, and Ryokan had received this recognition with apparent gratitude and then proceeded to spend the rest of his life ignoring most of what institutional Buddhism expected of a person who had received it. He did not head a temple. He did not take formal students. He did not produce the kind of carefully formatted Dharma talks that are later collected and published with commentary. He wandered for some years after Kokusen's death, begging his rice and vegetables in village after village, and eventually arrived at the grounds of Kokujoji near his home village in Echigo and settled into the small hut that happened to be empty. With the casual air of a man who has not been looking for a particular place and has found it anyway, there he had remained for 36 years. His days organized themselves simply. Before dawn, he rose and sat in meditation in the cold. After dawn, he put on his straw sandals and his monk's robe and walked into the surrounding villages with his begging bowl, accepting whatever was placed in it, a handful of rice, a pickled plum, a portion of vegetable soup, and offering in return what he had always offered, which was the quality of his presence. The villagers had various opinions about him over the years. Some thought him holy, some thought him simple, some thought him a character, which is often what people call those who refuse to perform what the world expects and yet manage to remain in it without obvious damage. The children of the village loved him without reservation, which was perhaps the most reliable assessment. He played with them. He played with a devotion and an uncalculated absorption that adults visiting the village sometimes found unsettling, a monk of considerable reputation, rolling in the snow with a group of children over the possession of a ball, clearly having the best time of anyone present. He sometimes forgot his begging round entirely because a game had not reached its natural conclusion. He did not appear to experience this as a failure of monastic discipline. After the mornings, he returned to Gyeongheo and wrote. He wrote in classical Chinese forms called kanshi and in the older Japanese forms called waka and in haiku. And he wrote the way some people breathe, not because they have decided to breathe, but because something in them knows that this is what they are for. His poems did not announce themselves as important. They spoke of small things, the first snow on a familiar hillside, the weight of an empty begging bowl, a conversation with a frog, the particular quality of moonlight through the gaps in his hut wall, the feeling of a brush moving over paper on a cold morning when the ink is thick and the hand must work deliberately. They spoke of loss without making loss into theatre. They spoke of beauty without making beauty into argument. And slowly, over 36 years, they accumulated into something that would outlast nearly everything else about him. By the winter of 1826, Ryokan was 68 years old. His body had been saying things for some time that required a different kind of attention than he was accustomed to giving. The begging rounds had shortened not by decision exactly, but by the way, a walk shortens when the feet are slower and the cold reaches the joints more persistently than it used to. The climb to certain hillside spots where he liked to sit in the afternoons had become first effortful and then, by degrees, impractical. His hands still held the brush, still produced calligraphy that those who understood such things described, even in these later years, as containing something almost frightening in its beauty, as if the shakiness in the hand had found its way into the line and become not a defect, but a different kind of truth. But they moved with more deliberateness now, and they trembled in the cold in a ways they had not trembled before. The previous summer he had been ill, a weakness in the lungs. The village doctor said the kind that collects in people who have spent decades sleeping on thin mats in poorly insulated rooms and moving through winter weather with the minimal protection a monk's robe provides. He had recovered. Not fully, in the way that a body which has recovered from something like this rarely returns fully to what it was before, but enough to resume his mornings, enough to walk the shorter version of his begging route, enough to sit at the table in Gyeongheo and write. One of his long-standing patrons, a man named Kimura Motuemon, a local landowner who had supplied Ryokan with paper for many years and who had never, in all those years, asked for anything in return beyond the occasional poem, which he kept without display in a cabinet in his study, had been suggesting, gently and persistently, across several winters, that Ryokan might consider moving into a room in Kimura's house. The house was warmer than Gyeongheo. It had a proper roof. It had someone to prepare meals. It had the quality, in short, of shelter that a man in his late 60s with weakened lungs probably needed and was, with characteristic stubbornness, not quite allowing himself to accept. Ryokan had declined each previous winter's suggestion with the gentle deflection of someone who is not sure he is ready to be known as someone who needs help. In the winter of 1826, he said yes. He moved his inkstone and his brushes and his bowl and the small wooden Buddha with the worn lacquer into the room Kimura had prepared, which was warm in a way that Gyeongheo had not been warm for many years. And he sat in this warmth with the complicated feelings of someone who has been independent for a very long time and has discovered, only now, that independence was not entirely the virtue he had taken it to be. He allowed Kimura's household to bring him meals rather than begging for them. He allowed a second blanket of a thickness he had not previously permitted himself. He allowed, in these ways and others, the practice of receiving care, which turns out to require its own form of practice, its own deliberate opening, its own specific kind of surrender that is different from, and in some ways more difficult than any surrender the meditation cushion has asked for. It was in Kimura's house, in the second month of 1826, on a cold morning when the snow was still deep, but the light had shifted its angle in the way that in Ichigo means that somewhere far below the surface of things, spring is beginning to consider itself, that Ryokan first met the nun called Taishin. She was 28 years old. She had been born the daughter of a samurai family in the domain of Nagaoka. They had married a doctor at 17 and had become a nun 5 years later when her husband died, following a path that ran opposite to the usual direction, inward rather than outward, toward silence rather than toward the next arrangement the world would have made for her. She had studied. She had written poetry in the haiku form with a precision and luminosity that the few who read her work found remarkable. And she had heard of Ryokan in the way one hears of certain rare and necessary things through a chain of quiet recommendations, each person in the chain feeling that this was something the next person needed to know. She had read some of his poems. One had stayed with her more than the others. It was the poem about the thief who came to Gyeongheo one night and found nothing worth stealing, who left while Ryokan sat in the empty doorway, looking at the moon. The poem's final movement, in which Ryokan thinks, "What a pity that I could not also give him." This beautiful moon had done something to her understanding of generosity that she could not have explained, but that she felt in her body when she read it. A loosening somewhere in the chest. That is what happens when an idea that has been sealed finally opens. She came to Kimura's house on a cold morning with an introduction from a mutual acquaintance and a small package of paper she had brought as a gift, because she had heard that Ryokan was always in need of paper. And because she did not want to arrive empty-handed to meet someone she had been thinking about meeting for a long time. Ryokan was sitting at the small table near the window. He had a brush in his hand and a piece of paper in front of him with 3 characters written on it and a 4th not yet committed to. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, which was directly and without social preparation. And she looked back at him the same way. And something in that exchange of looking established, without either of them naming it, the quality that the friendship would have for the rest of its duration. She sat down. She told him about the poem, about the thief and the moon, about what it had done to her understanding. Ryokan set down the brush. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that those who knew him described as the expression he wore when something surprised him in a direction he found genuinely pleasing. "You understood it," he said. "Not quite a question. I think so," Taishin said. "Though understanding a poem and being certain you have understood it are different things." "Yes," Ryokan said. He seemed to find this satisfying. "Yes. Sit down. Tell me what you understood." What followed, not just that morning, but across the months and then the years of their friendship, was something the literary historians of later centuries would categorize as a literary correspondence, a spiritual mentorship, a late-life love of the kind that has no convenient category, and would argue about the proportions of each of these things without arriving at a consensus. The people who saw them together in those years described something simpler and harder to name. 2 people, 40 years apart in age, who had each by separate and difficult roads arrived at the same country and who recognized each other as inhabitants of that country and were glad of the company. They exchanged poems. His long classical waka responding to her precise haiku, each of them reading what the other had written with the attention one gives to something that is trying to say something true. They talked through long winter afternoons about ordinary things, about a particular quality of ink that took color differently in cold weather, about a tree on the hillside above Gyeongheo that Ryokan missed from his new room's window, about the way certain memories arrive more vividly in old age than they did when they were recent, as if the mind, losing its grip on many things, holds more tightly to a few particular ones. They talked about the practice, about what the practice asks of a person at 70 that it had not asked at 40, about the specific quality of attention available to someone who has stopped having plans and has discovered that this is not the disaster they had expected, but something closer to its opposite. Ryokan told her once in the winter of 1828, when the weakness in his lungs had returned and the tremor in his hands had become a permanent companion rather than an occasional visitor, that he had been thinking about the moon. Not the physical moon precisely. Though he had loved the physical moon with a consistency and depth that ran like a thread through 50 years of poetry and had never frayed. He meant the moon as it appeared in the Zen teaching, the finger pointing at the moon, and the moon itself, and the distinction between the two. The moon that shines whether it is directly seen or blocked by cloud. That does not diminish when you look away from it. That illuminates equally the thief's retreating back and the monk's empty doorway, and the bowl and the brush and the cracked lacquer on a small wooden figure and the face of a young woman who came one cold morning with a package of paper and a poem she had understood. "When I am gone," Ryokan said, in the even tone of someone discussing the weather, "the moon will continue to do this. It will shine on whoever is sitting in whatever doorway they have found. This seems to me a complete and sufficient arrangement." Teishin was quiet for a moment. The fire in the brazier clicked softly. Outside the window, snow was falling in the particular way it falls in Echigo, not in a hurry, not dramatically, just steadily and without preference, covering everything with equal care. "And tonight," she said, "it is shining on this room." Ryokan looked at her. Something in his face did what his face sometimes did in the presence of things that moved him more than he had prepared for. He looked away toward the window for a moment, then back. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tonight it is shining on this room." He died on the 6th day of the new year, 1831. He was 72 years old. Teishin was with him. She recorded that he died seated, in the posture of meditation, quietly, and she used the phrase that is at once a simple description and something more than description. She wrote that he died just as if he were falling asleep. Before he died, he gave her a small poem, a single haiku about an autumn leaf, one that shows its hidden side and then its other side as it falls, visible in its entirety only in the act of falling, only in the movement between what it was and what it is becoming. The poem is not sad. It is not frightened. It is observing something with clear, unhurried eyes and finding it, in its own way, complete. Teishin spent the years after his death collecting everything he had written, every fragment on every scrap of paper, every poem copied into letters, every piece of calligraphy that had survived in someone's cabinet or storage box, and published it in a volume she called Hakisu, no Tsuyu, Dew on the Lotus. Without this act, which required both love and enormous practical patience, most of what Ryokan wrote would have been lost entirely. Because of it, those poems entered Japanese literary history and have never left. They have been read by people who have never heard the word Buddhism, who have no particular interest in Zen practice or monastic life, who find in the poems only the thing that is available to anyone who looks at the world long enough without blinking, that the ordinary things are not ordinary at all, and that the life available in a single room, with a bowl and a brush and the right company, is not a reduced life. It is a life from which nothing essential has been withheld. What Ryokan was practicing in his final years in the warm room in Kimura's house, with his trembling hands and his reliable brush, and Teishin sitting across the table, was something the Soto Zen tradition calls shikantaza, just sitting. Just this. just exactly what is present without addition or subtraction. Not a technique so much as an orientation, a turning of the whole attention toward what is actually here rather than what the mind would prefer to arrange instead. He had practiced this his entire life without calling it practice. Begging rather than having meals brought to him because the practice of receiving, of depending on the generosity of strangers, keeps the self appropriately permeable, keeps it from hardening into the kind of self-sufficiency that looks like strength but is actually a form of isolation. Playing with children rather than maintaining, the remover monk of his reputation might reasonably have claimed, because the practice of play, of uncalculated, fully present attention, is itself a form of meditation, perhaps the most honest form, since children cannot be fooled about whether you are actually there. Giving a thief his clothes and then sitting in the moonlight thinking, what a pity he could not also give him this. Writing poems that gave themselves away the moment they were done. All of it. The whole long eccentric life in the hut on the mountain had been preparation for just this final simplicity. The warm room, the reliable brazier, the bowl, the hands that still knew what to do even when they trembled, the company of someone who saw him clearly old and ill and slow and still somehow completely himself and was not frightened by what she saw. There is something that the final years of life ask of us that nothing earlier quite asks in the same way. Not courage exactly, though courage is part of it. More the willingness to receive, to allow the care of others without converting it into debt, to allow the body its own schedule of departure without resisting that schedule as though the resistance itself were a form of loyalty to life. To find in the bowl, in the brush, in the face across the table, in the snow falling equally on everything outside the window, not a consolation prize for having lost the larger life you planned, but the thing itself, the actual, irreducible, sufficient thing. Ryokan found it in a small room in winter, held by the warmth of a house that was not his own, and the attention of a woman 40 years younger than himself, who understood his poems and brought paper and stayed. The moon shone on that room. It shines on yours now. Let your hands rest open, or let them rest however they have chosen to rest. Let your face release whatever it has been holding since this morning. If you are being cared for tonight, if someone has made the room warm, or covered you with a blanket, or simply knows where you are, let that care land. Let it be received. You do not need to account for it. It is simply here. The breath comes and goes, quietly, without asking permission, without needing to be guided. We travel now from the snow country of Japan to the mountains of Korea, to a master who in his final years had left behind the robes and the title and the monastery itself, and was wandering through the northern mountains as an old man with long hair, teaching children to read in villages that had no school, carrying his entire practice in a body that no longer looked like a monk's body and had never been more fully a monk. Let your eyes be heavy now. Let the darkness behind them be restful rather than empty. In the northern mountains of Korea, in the years after 1905, when the Joseon dynasty had finally collapsed under the weight of its own exhaustion and the Japanese occupation had begun its slow, methodical work of replacing one country with the outline of another, there was an old man who walked the mountain roads between villages with no particular destination and no particular hurry, and no visible indication that he had ever been anything other than what he appeared to be. He appeared to be a wanderer, His hair was long and loose, in a way that was neither the tonsured head of a monk nor the carefully oiled topknot of a Confucian scholar. It was simply the hair of someone who had stopped cutting it and was not especially troubled by sem. His clothes were the clothes of a layman, worn and patched at the elbows, appropriate to neither wealth nor deliberate poverty, just the ordinary clothing of someone moving through ordinary weather. He carried a small bundle. He sometimes stopped in villages for several days and sometimes was gone before dawn, and no one who observed him could determine a pattern. In one village, he had stayed for 3 weeks and taught the children to read Chinese characters sitting with them in the open air in front of the village well, drawing the characters in the dust with a stick, patient beyond what patience usually looks like, returning to the same character as many times as needed, with the same steadiness the 20th time as the first. In another village, he had helped repair a collapsed section of roof in exchange for a meal and had said nothing during the entire morning of work, beyond the occasional practical comment about the angle of a beam. In a third village, someone had recognized him, or thought they had, and had gone to the local temple and returned with the young monk there, breathless, saying that Gyeongheo Sunim was sitting by the well, the master Gyeongheo, the one who had revived Korean Seon, and the young monk had gone to look and had come back uncertain, because the man by the well did not look like any image of a great master he had been shown. And when the young monk had approached and said Sunim, the man had looked up from the game he was playing with 3 children over a collection of small stones and said nothing at all, which could have meant yes, or could have meant simply that the question was not the right one. His name, the name he had been born with, the name his mother had given a boy child in Jeonju in the year 1846, was Song Dongguk. He had become a monk at the age of 8, when his mother, a widow who could not provide for both herself and her child, had brought him to the temple at Cheonggyesa and placed him in the care of the monk Gyeongheo, who had taken the boy in and put him to work carrying water and gathering firewood in exchange for food and the beginning of an education. At 13, a Confucian scholar who happened to be staying at the temple had noticed the boy's quickness, the speed with which he absorbed the Chinese characters. The scholar was teaching him as a casual act of hospitality and had enough begun to teach him seriously. And the boy had proved so fast and so thorough that the scholar had told the abbot he had never encountered a student like this one, which was the kind of statement that, when made about a boy in a Buddhist temple in 19th century Korea, tended to set events in motion. By his late 20s, Gyeongheo had become one of the most respected Buddhist lecturers in Korea, a teacher of texts and doctrine, invited to speak at the major temples, possessed of a reputation for clarity that drew students from distant monasteries. He had everything that a man in his position was supposed to want. And then a cholera epidemic swept through the villages near Donghaksa Temple, where he was teaching. And Gyeongheo went out among the sick and dying to do what he could, and found that his learning all of it, every sutra and commentary and perfectly memorized passage, was worth almost nothing in the face of what he was encountering. The text spoke about suffering. They described it with great precision. They organized it into categories and offered frameworks for its analysis and pathways for its transformation. And the dying people in the mud-floored houses around the temple needed something the texts could not give them. And Gyeongheo, standing in a room with a woman who would be dead by morning and who was looking at him in a way that expected more than framework and analysis, understood with a clarity that no lecture had ever produced that he did not actually know what he was talking about. He returned to Donghaksa. He dismissed his students. He locked himself in his room with a single wadu, a Seon question, unanswerable by logic, designed to exhaust the thinking mind and open something beyond it, and he sat with it for 3 months. On the final day of those 3 months, a novice knocked on his door and asked through the wood, "What does it mean that even if you became a cow, there would be no hole for the nostril ring?" At that moment, something in Gyeongheo dissolved. Not dramatically, not with lights or visions or any of the supernatural accompaniments that sometimes appear in such accounts. Just the bottom of the problem fell out. The 10,000 things that had been organized in his mind by 40 years of study fell away like dust from a surface that had been cleaned. And what was left was not a different arrangement of the same contents, but something prior to all arrangement. Something that had been present the whole time and had simply been obscured by the complexity piled on top of it. He opened the door. The novice looked at him. Gyeongheo said, "I have heard about the cow with no nostrils. And suddenly, the whole universe is my home." He spent the next 2 decades building and teaching at Seon meditation halls across Korea, at Sudeoksa and Beomeosa and Haeinsa and Songwangsa, the great old monasteries that were the backbone of Korean Buddhist practice. He trained the monks who would train the monks who would reconstruct Korean Buddhism after the occupation. He was, by every measure that the tradition used to measure such things, one of the most important figures in Korean Buddhism in 1,000 years. And then, in 1905, at the age of 59, he walked away. Not secretly, not dramatically, he simply stopped. He let his hair grow. He put on lay clothes. He left the monastery system without announcement or explanation and began walking north, toward the mountains of Pyongan and Hamgyong provinces, the remote and rugged upper country where the villages were small and the winters were hard, and nobody was likely to recognize a wandering old man as someone who had once been called the reviver of Korean Buddhism. The reasons, if he left any, are not recorded. His disciples had various theories. Some said he had grown tired of the institutional weight that had accumulated around his name. Some said he had always believed that the highest stage of practice was the one in which the ox herder, having found the ox and tamed it and ridden it home, finally disappears into the marketplace with no distinguishing marks, no robe, no title, no visible sign of attainment, and simply lives among ordinary people, in the ordinary way that is not ordinary at all. Some said he was simply ready to be finished with being Gyeongheo and wanted to find out what was left. What was left, it turned out, was an old man with long hair who was very good at teaching children to read. In the winter of 1910, in a village called Do-ha-dong in Gapsan County, a village in the mountains where the snow came early and stayed late, and where the nearest proper school was a day's walk in good weather, there was a group of 6 children who had been learning Chinese characters from the old man who had arrived 3 weeks earlier and whose name they did not know. He had arrived on a day when the first real snow of the season was falling. Walking up the mountain path with his bundle and his unhurried gait in the way of someone who had been walking a long time and had no particular feelings about continuing to walk. The headman's wife had offered him a meal because that was what you did when an old man arrived in the snow, and he had accepted without fuss and had slept that night in the storage room off the kitchen, on a mat that was perfectly adequate. And in the morning, he had come out to find 3 children drawing in the frozen mud of the courtyard with sticks and had sat down beside them and asked what they were drawing. They had told him. He had drawn something in the mud beside their drawings, a character, the first character of the Chinese word for mountain. He had drawn it slowly and had explained each stroke, not as a lecture but as a conversation, the way you explain something to someone who is standing beside you looking at the same thing. The next day, there were 5 children. The day after that, 6. By the end of the first week, the old man was conducting something that was not quite a school, but that functioned like one held in the cold air in front of the headman's house. Using a flat area of packed snow as a surface when the mud froze too solid to mark. Using sticks and occasionally a piece of charcoal when sticks were not precise enough. He did not tell them he was teaching them Buddhism. He did not give Dharma talks. He did not explain the Huadu or the nature of mind or the 6 paramitas or any of the things he had spent 40 years learning and teaching in the formal way. He drew characters in the snow and waited while small cold hands reproduced them, and corrected them when they were wrong, and praised them when they were right. And sometimes told stories while they practiced stories about farmers and monks and old women and rivers and the particular quality of patience required by certain problems that cannot be solved by effort alone. One afternoon, a girl named Sunja, she was perhaps 9 years old, the quickest of the group, the one who had mastered the first 20 characters before the others had mastered 10, looked up from her practice and asked him directly, "Are you a monk?" The old man looked at her. He looked at her in the way he looked at the characters the children drew carefully, without preconception, willing to see what was actually there rather than what he expected. "I was," he said. "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment. The snow had begun again. Small dry flakes that landed on the practice surface and erased the characters as fast as the children wrote them. "I didn't stop," he said finally. "I just put down some of the things monks carry, to see what was still there underneath them." Sunja considered this. She was at the age where she had not yet learned that certain questions are impolite. "What was still there?" she asked. The old man looked at the snow erasing the characters. He looked at the girl's face, her cold reddened cheeks, her serious and genuinely curious expression, her stick still held in her mittened hand, ready for the next character. "This," he said. He gestured not at anything in particular, or at everything in general. The gesture took in the snow, and the children, and the mountain, and the village, and the cold afternoon light falling at its winter angle across the practice ground. Just this. It was here the whole time. Sunja looked at what he had gestured at. Then she looked back at her practice surface and drew the next character carefully in the snow. And the snow accepted it and held it for a moment and then slowly, gently, erased it. The way snow erases everything it loves. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1912, the old man woke before dawn in the room of a local school in Do-ha Dong, where he had been staying for several weeks, complaining of what the villagers described as extreme tiredness, not the tiredness of illness exactly, but the tiredness of someone who has finished something very long and has sat down at last. He asked for paper and a brush. He wrote what those who later collected and translated his work called a death gatha, a verse composed at the moment of departure. The verse, as it has come down to us, says something like this: "I have walked a long road, and the road has been good. Now I set the bundle down. The morning light is still the morning light." Then he rested, and he did not wake again. His disciples Mangong and Haiwol, who had been searching for their teacher for years and learned of his death only afterward, came to Do-ha Dong and arranged for his cremation. They performed it on the 14th of September of the following year, on a mountain called Nandeoksan, according to the tradition. The villagers of Do-ha Dong, most of whom had not known who he was, came to the ceremony because they had known who he was, not in the sense of his title or his lineage or his place in the history of Korean Buddhism, but in the sense of the man who sat in the snow and taught their children to read. Sunja, who was 11 years old by then, he stood at the back of the gathering, and held the 23 characters she had learned from him in her memory, the way you hold something that has been given to you by someone who did not make a ceremony of the giving. She never forgot a single one. What Gyeongheo was practicing in those final 7 years of wandering in the lay clothes, in the small village schoolrooms and open-air practice grounds, in the storage rooms and schoolhouse floors where he slept, was something that the Korean Seon tradition traces back to the ox-herding pictures, the ancient sequence of images that map the arc of practice from confusion to return. The final image in the sequence is not the image of a monk sitting in perfect meditation, robes arranged, expressions serene. It is an image of an ordinary person in a marketplace. No distinguishing marks, no visible signs of anything in particular. Just a person among people, doing what people do. The verse that accompanies this image says, "The gate of his cottage is closed, and even the wisest cannot find him." He goes his own way, making no effort to follow the steps of earlier sages. This is not the image of failure. It is the image of completion. The one who has found the ox and tamed it and ridden it home and understood that ox and rider were never two separate things. This one has no further need of the symbols of finding. The robe falls away. The title falls away. The monastery falls away. What remains is the person, before any of it the person who was always there. Beneath the accumulation of practice and reputation and institutional role. As simple and as present as a child drawing characters in the snow, Gyeongheo spent 40 years becoming a great master and 7 years discovering what had been there before the greatness. What was there, it turned out, was not nothing. It was something quieter and more durable than greatness. It was the capacity to sit beside a child in the cold and draw a character in the snow and wait while the small hand learned to reproduce it. It was the capacity to be simply present in a village that did not know his name and did not need to know it. It was the capacity that the ox-herding pictures point toward and that very few people reach, not because it is beyond them, but because it requires giving up so completely what they have been using to measure themselves that the indacilide giving up feels, from the outside, like loss. There is a question that runs through the Korean Seon tradition in the form of a hwadu, and Gyeongheo himself used it throughout his teaching years. Before you were born, before your parents gave you a name, before the world gave you a role, before you accumulated the long list of things you are and things you are not, what was your original face? This question is not asking for a philosophical answer. It is not asking you to think harder. It is asking you to feel, in the quiet beneath all the activity of self-making, what has been present the whole time. The robe is put down. The title is put down. The monastery is put down. The long, successful career is put down. The reputation, good or bad, is put down. The carefully maintained sense of what you are is put down. Carefully. Like setting down a bundle that has been carried a long way. And what is there? What is the face before the face you show the world? This is the question Gyeongheo spent his final years living rather than asking. Walking the mountain roads with long loose hair and ordinary clothes, eating whatever was offered, sleeping wherever there was a mat, sitting in the snow with children who did not know his name and did not need to, drawing the character for mountain in the frozen ground and watching the small hand learn it, and then watching the snow come and erase it, and finding this all of it. The learning and the erasing both completely and sufficiently beautiful. Just this. It was here the whole time. And as that recognition settles in you, the thing that has been here the whole time, beneath the name and the role and the list of what you have or haven't accomplished, let the body soften a little more. Notice if you like, that the breath does not know your name. It comes and goes the same way regardless of what you have done today, or what you failed to do, or what you are afraid of tomorrow. It serves you without condition. It asks nothing in return. Let your shoulders fall. Let your jaw release. Let the weight of what you call yourself rest for a moment in the hands of something that has been holding you all along without making much of it. The next story travels south and back in time to Vietnam in the 13th century, to a king who won 2 wars against the armies of Kublai Khan, and then, in the fullness of his power and reputation, and at the height of what the world would have called his success, walked out of his palace at midnight and began climbing a mountain. He was 41 years old. He had decided it was time to begin. Let that image carry you forward gently as your body finds its way toward rest. In the 13th century, in the kingdom the Vietnamese called Dai Viet, a kingdom pressed between mountains and sea, a long, narrow country that had survived for generations by being exactly as flexible as the situation required and exactly as stubborn as survival demanded. There was a king who had done everything a king is supposed to do, and who had been waiting, across the entire length of doing it, for the chance to do something else entirely. His name at birth was Tran Kham. He was born in the 11th month of 1258, the year of the horse, the eldest son of King Tran Tan Tong and the queen who would later be known as Nguyen Tan. The court historians who wrote about his birth used the language court historians always use about important births: the golden complexion, the bright spirit, the signs that marked him as someone the world was already preparing a large role for, and in this case, unusually, the language happened to be accurate. There was something in the boy that the monks who came to court recognized as distinct. Not precocity exactly, not the quick intelligence that impresses teachers and then plateaus in adolescence. Something quieter and less demonstrative than that. A quality of attention, of being fully where he was, while somehow also being present to something that did not change with circumstances, that the Buddhist teachers at court had a word for, and that the Confucian scholars, with their different vocabulary, also noticed and found difficult to categorize. He had not wanted the throne. This is recorded in the histories not as the ritual modesty expected of princes, but as a genuine and repeated attempt to redirect the trajectory the world was assigning him. Twice as a young man he had tried to go to Yen Tu Mountain, the long wooded range rising from the hills of what is now Quang Ninh province in northeastern Vietnam, where Buddhist practitioners had been establishing hermitages and meditation halls for generations, where the air at altitude carried the smell of pine resin and something older than pine resin, where the mist moved through the ridgelines in the early morning in a way that made the word impermanent feel not like a philosophical proposition, but like a simple physical description of what was happening in front of you. Both times he had been found and brought back. His father, King Thánh Tông, had done the bringing back himself. With the combination of genuine love and immovable paternal authority that is the specific combination most effective against the sincere intentions of a young man who has not yet learned that some mountains require a longer approach than can be managed in a single night. At 21, he became king. He accepted this. He accepted it with the quality of attention that had always characterized him, not resignation, which is the acceptance of someone who has stopped believing anything better is possible, but the acceptance of someone who understands that the present responsibility is real and that the thing they are waiting for will still be there when the responsibility is fulfilled. He ruled. He married the eldest daughter of the queen's family. He read the Buddhist texts that his teacher, The layman master, Tue Trong, gave him and practiced what could be practiced inside the palace. In the midst of the ceremonies and audiences and negotiations and deliberate performances of power that a king must maintain to remain one, he maintained them. The records describe him as a fair and thoughtful ruler, someone who treated the servants of the court with the same quality of attention he brought to his senior ministers, who asked questions before making decisions, who had the particular patience with complexity that comes from being genuinely interested in truth rather than in confirmation of what he already believes. He was, by every measure the world used to measure these things, doing well. And then the world asked something larger of him. In the year 1285, the armies of Kublai Khan entered Dai Viet. The Mongol forces that had reorganized the known world from the Pacific to the Danube, that had absorbed China into the Yuan dynasty and sent ambassadors to Japan and Korea with the message that the choice between submission and destruction was straightforward, came south into the long, narrow kingdom at the edge of the sea. They came with an army that the historical records estimate in the hundreds of thousands, and the Vietnamese forces that met them were vastly smaller. And the king, who had not wanted to be a king, found that he was also, when the moment required it, a general. He convened the Dien Hong assembly. He gathered the elder men of the kingdom, the village headmen, the senior farmers and craftsmen and merchants whose lives had been built on this particular ground, and he asked them directly, in a way that no king had asked before, "Do we resist or do we surrender?" The elders answered together, with a single word that the histories record as rising from the assembly like something physical: resist. And so they resisted. They drove the Mongol forces back. Not quickly, not easily, not without the particular cost that wars extract from the people who survive them as well as those who do not, but they drove them back. And 3 years later, in 1288, the Khan's forces came again, and again the kingdom resisted, and again they drove them back. The second victory was larger than the first. The commander, Tren Hung Dao, the king's cousin. The military genius of the resistance positioned the Vietnamese forces along the Bat Dang River and waited with iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the tidal water. And when the Mongol fleet came upriver, the tide went out, and the stakes rose, and the fleet was destroyed. And the war that had threatened to end, Dai Viet as an independent kingdom, ended instead with the kingdom intact, and the Mongol forces withdrawing to reconsider. When the Second War ended, Trần Nhân Tông was 30 years old. He had defended a kingdom. He had held together a people across 2 invasions, and the devastation that invasions leave behind in the fields and the villages and the faces of the people who survive them. He had been everything his father and the court and the history of his dynasty had needed him to be. He still wanted to climb the mountain. He waited. Not with impatience exactly. Patience was one of the qualities the practice had cultivated in him, and he understood that the waiting itself was part of the path, but with the particular clarity of someone who knows what they are waiting for and has been watching the conditions approach for a long time. He managed the peace. He attended to the kingdom's reconstruction, the relationships with neighboring states that war had disturbed, the 10,000 practical demands of governing a people who have survived something enormous and need the ordinary texture of their lives rebuilt carefully around them. He did all of this thoroughly and well. And then his son was old enough, and the transfer could be made without tearing what had been built. And Trần Nhân Tông abdicated the throne, transferred power to his son, Trần An Tông, and spent 5 years in the role the court called Tai Tuong Hoang, King Father, which was not quite the throne and not quite outside it. Present, when the new king needed counsel and stepping back when he did not. He was 41 years old when he finally began to climb. On a night in the year 1299, the records give the month as the 10th month. When the harvest is in and the mountain paths are dry and the first coolness of autumn has begun to move through the forest canopy, he walked out of the palace. He left the dragon robe on its stand. He left the jade seal. He walked through the palace gates with a small group of attendants who understood that their role was to accompany him to the mountain and then return alone. Because this was what he had asked of them. And because they understood that what he was doing was not the action of a man abandoning his responsibilities, but of a man finally, after 20 years of patient preparation, taking up the one responsibility he had always known was his. The attendants brought him to the mountain and returned without him. Trần Nhân Tông began to climb. The path up Yentu mountain in the late 13th century was not paved or maintained in the way that pilgrimage routes would later be maintained when the mountain became a destination rather than a practice. It was a narrow track through dense mixed forest, pine and bamboo, and the broad-leaved trees that hold moisture through the dry season and smell. In the early morning, of something between tea and rain, it ascended through 10 hermitage sites, established at intervals by the generations of practitioners who had been coming to this mountain before Trần Nhân Tông was born, each site a little higher than the last, each requiring more of the legs and more willingness to leave the easier ground below. He stopped at Hoa Yen, the Flowering Clouds Hermitage, at roughly the midpoint of the ascent, and shaved his head. He received the ordination name Hương Vân Đại Đầu Đà, the great ascetic monk of the fragrant cloud. He put on the hemp robe of a forest monk, coarse, undyed, the color of unbleached linen, and continued climbing. At the peak, or near the peak, at a hermitage called Ngua Van, the cloud resting place, where the ridge dissolves into the sky and the mist comes and goes with a frequency that makes the boundary between mountain and cloud a matter of ongoing negotiation. He built a small structure and established a practice space and began the 9 years of teaching that would become the foundation of the Trúc Lâm Yentu school, the bamboo forest school of Vietnamese Zen. The first unified and distinctly Vietnamese lineage of Buddhist practice. He had not climbed the mountain to disappear. This is important, and it is something his teacher, Thuy Trung, had pointed toward for years. The purpose of the practice is not to leave the world, but to find the ground from which the world can be engaged without being consumed by it. He traveled the mountain ridges and descended into the valley communities and taught monks and nuns and farmers and market workers and ordinary people who had heard that the former king had become a monk and had come, as people do, partly from curiosity and partly from the genuine need that brings people to teachers when the ordinary structures of meaning have shown themselves to be less durable than advertised. What he taught was called Ku Tren Lak Dao, living in the world, joyful in the way. The teaching said, in various forms across 9 years of expression, the separation you feel between the sacred and the ordinary is not in the nature of things. It is in the quality of attention you bring. The mountain did not give me something the palace lacked. The mountain gave me clarity to see what was always already there. In the 3rd year of his practice on Yentu, a man climbed the mountain to see him. The man was not a monk and had no intention of becoming one. He was a court official, a man of perhaps 45 years, who had served in the court of the former king and then in the court of the new king, and who was good at his work in the particular way of people who have learned to be good at work that is not quite what they wanted to be doing. He had a family. He had responsibilities. He had, by any reasonable external measure, a complete and functional life. He had been climbing since before dawn. He arrived at Hoa Yen in the early afternoon, dusty and breathing hard, and he sat for a long time before he could compose himself to speak. When he could speak, he said, "I have been telling myself for 20 years that I will begin to live properly. I will begin to do the thing I actually mean to do with my life, when certain conditions are in place, when the children are grown, when certain debts are resolved, when the political situation stabilizes, when I feel ready, and I have watched you do what you did, leave what you left, climb what you climbed, and I have understood something I have been resisting understanding. Those conditions will never all be in place simultaneously. There will always be another reason. I have been waiting for a moment that the structure of my waiting makes it impossible to arrive." He stopped. His hands were resting on his knees, palms down, the way hands rest when a person is trying to keep himself stable. Trần Nhân Tông looked at him. He looked at him the way he had learned to look at things on the mountain, with the full, unhurried attention that does not reach for conclusion but waits for what is actually there to show itself. "Tell me," he said, "when you imagine this life you have been postponing, when you hold it in your mind as the life you will live when the conditions are right, what does it feel like?" The official was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It feels like something real, like something already existing somewhere, waiting." "Yes," said the monk, "because it is not a future state that must be constructed from the correct arrangement of circumstances. It is present right now, in this moment, beneath the waiting. The waiting is what you have learned to put between yourself and it." The official sat with this. Around them, the mountain was doing what it does in the afternoon, going quiet. The birds settling into the high branches, the light shifting from the gold of midday to the deeper amber of approaching evening. The mist beginning to move in from the east across the ridgeline in long, slow drifts that made the forest look, from a certain angle, like a painting of itself. "I abdicated at 41. Trần Nhân Tông said, "Not because everything was resolved, nothing is ever fully resolved. And a kingdom is perhaps the least resolvable thing in existence. I abdicated because my son was ready to receive what I carried, and because I understood that waiting for the perfect moment to begin is the same as deciding never to begin. The step comes before the feeling of readiness, not after. I was not ready to climb this mountain when I began to climb it. I was simply climbing." The official looked at his hands on his knees. He looked at the mountain descending below him, and the mist arriving above him, and the monk sitting across from him in the hemp robe that was the color of unbleached linen, and that had no gold thread, and no jade ornament, and no indication whatsoever that the person wearing it had once commanded 2 successful defenses against the armies of Kublai Khan. He stayed at Hua Yen for 3 days. When he descended, he did not return to the court. He went home. He began making arrangements, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, the way the tide comes in, without announcement, without ceremony, with the complete and quiet intention of something that has decided what it is doing and requires no further deliberation. On the night of the 1st of November, 1208, at the hermitage of Ngoa Van, near the peak of Yên Tử, Trần Nhân Tông called his attendant novice Bao Sa to him and spoke quietly and clearly about what was approaching. He showed no distress. He showed no performance of equanimity, which is its own form of distress, dressed in better clothing. He showed simply the quality that the mountain had clarified in him across 9 years of practice, the capacity to be fully present to what is happening without requiring it to be different. He died that night, in meditation posture, at the age of 51. The records say the room had a quality of stillness that those present found difficult to describe afterward. Not the stillness of absence, but the particular stillness of something that has been fully gathered and has now, completely and without remainder, released. His disciples collected his relics and built a stupa at Ngöavan. They continued teaching what he had taught. The Truk Yentu lineage he founded continued for generations, its teachers descending from the mountain to teach in the valleys and the market towns and the rice paddies and the courts of subsequent kings, carrying the same central teaching in different words, that the ground you are looking for is not at the top of any mountain. The mountain is only a place where the conditions for seeing clearly are somewhat more available than they are in a palace. The ground itself is here. It has always been here. In this breath, in this body, in this moment that does not require the resolution of anything before it consents to be what it is. The step comes first. The feeling of readiness follows. Not before. After. This is what a king learned when he finally, at 41, stopped waiting to feel ready and began to climb. Let that arrive gently. Not as pressure, not as another thing you should be doing differently. Just as a permission. The life you are in right now, in this dark room, in this body, with this breath coming and going without being asked, this is not the waiting room. This is the place. Let your shoulders fall. Let the hands open slightly if they have been closed. Let the jaw release whatever it has been holding since this afternoon. If there is something you have been postponing until conditions improve, some version of yourself you have been reserving for a better moment, you can let that reservation soften now. Not forever. Just for this breath. And then the next one. The next story carries us from the long forests of Vietnam to the high cold plateau of Tibet to a master named Longchenpa, who was forced from everything he had built, exiled to a foreign country with no monastery and no students, and nothing but the sky above him and the ground beneath him, and who discovered in that stripping away that the thing he had been writing about for 30 years had been available all along in exactly that much. Let the breath carry you there. Let the body be heavy and held and at rest. In the year 1359, on the Tibetan plateau, where the air is thin enough that breathing itself becomes a kind of practice, and where the sky at altitude has a quality of blue that does not exist at lower elevations, a blue so saturated and so present that, looking up into it, feels less like looking at a color and more like looking into a depth that has no floor, a monk named Longchenpa was told to leave. He was 51 years old. He had spent the previous 3 decades producing what would later be recognized as the most comprehensive and luminous systematization of Dzogchen teaching that the Tibetan Buddhist tradition had ever seen. Over 200 texts, of which the 7 treasuries were the most celebrated. Writings that attempted to do something almost impossible, to organize into words and categories and carefully sequenced explanations, the teaching that all organizing and categorizing and explaining are themselves the movement of the very mind whose nature you are trying to understand. He had done this with a rigor and a poetic precision that later scholars, reading him across the centuries, described as something between philosophical genius and direct transmission, as if the texts themselves carried something that the words were only partially responsible for. He had been born in 1308 in a village called Todrong in the Tra Valley of central Tibet, the son of a father who was himself an accomplished practitioner of the Nyingma lineage and a mother who descended from the family of Dromtonpa, one of the great teachers of the Kadampa tradition. He had been, from childhood, the kind of student that teachers remember for the rest of their lives, absorbing texts with a speed that other students found both inspiring and slightly demoralizing. possessing the capacity to hold complex systems of thought in simultaneous relation without losing the thread of any of them, and demonstrating, alongside all of this intellectual capacity, the additional quality that distinguishes scholars from masters, the capacity to practice what he understood. By the age of 19, he was studying at Sangpo Nyutog, one of the great monastic colleges of Tibet, and receiving teachings from more than 20 masters across multiple lineages, Nyingma and Sakya and Kagyu and Kadam, the full breadth of Tibetan Buddhist scholarship in the 14th century. He received teachings from the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, from whom he learned the 6 yogas of Naropa and the 6 dharmas of the Kalachakra. He spent 8 months in complete darkness in retreat, where visions came to him that he later recorded in texts that those familiar with such accounts describe as among the most vivid and precise descriptions of the inner landscape of Dzogchen practice in any language. And then, in his late 20s, he met the master who changed everything. His name was Rigdzin Kumaradza, an old man by the time Longchenpa found him. Born in 1266 and therefore past 80 when the meeting occurred. Living not in a fixed monastery, but moving with a nomadic community of perhaps 70 students across the valleys and high pastures of central Tibet. Carrying the Dzogchen teachings in the way the teachings themselves recommended carrying everything, lightly, without permanent address, available to whatever ground presented itself. Kumaradza was known as the master who would give the complete Dzogchen transmission to anyone who asked with genuine intention, regardless of their lineage or their institutional affiliation or what they could offer in return, which made him beloved by serious practitioners and somewhat inconvenient to the institutions that preferred to control the flow of advanced teachings. Longchenpa traveled to find him and found him and received the teachings. He underwent intensive retreat under Kumaradza's guidance, in conditions that the biographical accounts describe with a specificity that suggests they were recorded by someone who was there. It was winter. The food was scarce. The retreat shelter was inadequate against the cold, and Longchenpa and the other students slept in meditation boxes, narrow wooden structures just large enough to sit upright in, which preserved body heat through the night while maintaining the posture of practice. He emerged from this period saying that something had resolved that no amount of study had resolved, that the nature of mind he had been reading about and writing about for 20 years had become, in the cold and the hunger and the darkness of those winter months, simply what was present, without any further qualification required. He spent the following years writing, prolific beyond what seems possible for a single human lifespan. He produced text after text not quickly, in the way that quantity suggests carelessness, but with the thoroughness of someone who has seen something clearly and is attempting, from every possible angle, to describe it completely. The 7 treasuries, the 3 trilogies, the Nyingtig Yapshi, the fourfold heart essence, the compilation of the most advanced Dzogchen teachings that had been transmitted separately across different lineages and that Longchenpa brought together into a single coherent system for the first time. He became the Khenpo of Samye Monastery, Tibet's first and most historically significant temple. He taught. He was, in the middle decades of his life, exactly what the tradition needed him to be. A teacher of unparalleled comprehensiveness and clarity at a moment when the Nyingma lineage needed exactly that. And then, in 1359, the political situation in Tibet shifted in a direction that made his continued presence difficult. The details are complex and involve the competing patronage networks and institutional rivalries of 14th century Tibetan politics, which were as intricate and as occasionally dangerous as the politics of any sophisticated civilization. But the essential fact was simple. The man who held secular power in the region had reasons, personal or political or both, to want Longchenpa gone. An order of exile was issued. Longchenpa, at 51, gathered what could be carried and went. He went to Bhutan. Bhutan, in the 14th century, was not the organized kingdom it would later become. It was a collection of valleys separated by the high ridges of the Himalayan foothills. Each valley, more or less its own world, connected to the others by passes that were possible in summer and impassable or nearly so in winter. Inhabited by people who were Tibetan in language and culture and Buddhist in practice, but who had their own relationship with the mountains and the particular quality of life that mountain valleys produce, self-sufficient, unhurried by the pace of larger civilizations, possessed of the patience that comes from living in a place where the seasons dictate more of the schedule than any human authority. Longchenpa arrived in the Bumthang Valley, a broad, fertile valley in the center of Bhutan, surrounded by forested ridges that catch the monsoon clouds and release them slowly across the valley floor through the summer months, with no monastery, no established community of students, no institutional support, and no certainty about how long he would be there or whether he would be permitted to return. He was 51 years old, in a foreign country, without the structures that had organized his life for 3 decades. The library he had built at Samye was behind him. The students he had trained were behind him. The texts he had compiled and organized were behind him. The reputation, the institutional role, the specific gravity that accumulates around a figure of his accomplishment in a tradition that knows how to honor its great teachers, all of it was behind him. Separated from him by a mountain range, and a political decision made by someone who did not particularly care what it cost. He had the sky above him. He had the valley below him. He had, in his memory and in his body and in whatever it is that genuine practice deposits somewhere deeper than memory or body, 30 years of Dzogchen. He began to teach. He traveled through the Bhutanese valleys on foot, stopping in communities where people gathered to hear him, establishing small hermitages at sites where the landscape itself seemed to invite stillness, a clearing on a ridgeline, a shelf of rock above a river, a grove of old trees at the edge of a meadow where the morning mist collected and slowly lifted. He taught whoever came, monks who had heard he was in the valley and traveled to find him, lay people whose relationship with Buddhist practice was more informal but no less sincere, farmers and herders whose daily lives contained more of what Dzogchen pointed toward than many monastery-trained scholars had managed to find. What he taught them was what he had always taught: the nature of mind, the recognition of awareness, the understanding that what you are looking for is not separate from what is doing the looking. But those who recorded what happened in those years in Bhutan describe something different in the quality of the teaching during this period. Not different in content, the content was the same, consistent with everything he had written before, but different in texture. As if the exile had done something to the teaching that the years of scholarly productivity and institutional position had not quite done, stripped it of everything that was not essential. The way long water strips stone of everything that is not stone. He was, the accounts suggest, clearer in Bhutan than he had been in Tibet. Not because he was more learned, he could not have been more learned, but because the circumstances had removed everything he had been using, without entirely realizing it, to supplement what he knew. When the monastery is gone, and the library is gone, and the title is gone, and the students who reflect your importance back to you are gone, and you are simply a man of 51 in a foreign valley with the sky above you and the ground beneath you, what remains? What remains, Longchenpa discovered, was not diminished. It was clarified. He told a student once, a young Bhutanese monk who had found him sitting on a flat rock above the Bumthang River, apparently doing nothing in particular with great completeness, that he had learned more in his first year of exile than in the previous decade of scholarly production. The student asked how this was possible. Longchenpa was quiet for a moment, watching the river. "The problem with knowing a great deal," he said, "is that knowing becomes its own kind of landscape. You begin to navigate by what you know rather than by what is present. And what is present, the actual, immediate. The living nature of this moment can become invisible behind the very knowledge that was supposed to reveal it." The exile removed the knowledge landscape. And what was left when it was removed was not emptiness. It was this. He gestured at the river, at the rock, at the afternoon light coming at its late-day angle across the valley. This, which was always here. The student looked at the river. He looked at the light. He looked back at the teacher. "Was it difficult?" he asked. The exile. The leaving. Longchenpa considered this honestly. "Yes," he said. "For some time, the mind that has organized itself around particular structures, a library, a monastery, a role, a reputation, a sense of belonging to a specific place, does not release those structures easily or without pain. It grieves them. This is not wrong. Grief is the appropriate response to real loss. But grief, when it is allowed to move through rather than being held still, arrives eventually at something that is not consolation and is not the restoration of what was lost. It arrives at the recognition that what you actually are was not located in any of those structures, that it was present before them and is present after them and was present all along inside them. If you had known how to look." He paused. The river continued below them, catching the late light on its surface in the way rivers catch light when everything else has gone still. "The Dzogchen teachings say," he said, "that the nature of mind is like the sky. Not like a room. A room has walls. A room has a ceiling. A room has a particular address. Like the sky. And the sky does not grieve the passing of clouds. Not because it is indifferent to clouds. The clouds are fully present in the sky. The sky contains them completely. The sky is in some sense made visible by them, but because the sky understands, if sky can be said to understand anything, that it was never the clouds, that the passing of any particular formation does not diminish it, that it will be the sky when the next cloud comes, and when that cloud passes, and when the season changes, and the quality of light changes, and the very mountain below it wears down slowly over centuries into a gentler shape. You are that," Longchenpa said to the young monk. "Not the monastery. Not the role. Not the particular arrangement of your life that you have come to rely on as proof that you exist and matter. The sky. And the sky does not need better conditions in order to be the sky. It is already entirely itself in whatever conditions are present." The young monk sat with this for a long time. The river went on below them. The light continued its movement toward evening. Then he asked, "How do you find the sky when the clouds are very thick?" Longchenpa almost smiled. "You don't find it," he said. "You stop insisting that you are the clouds." Longchenpa spent 6 years in Bhutan. He established 8 teaching sites across the Bhutanese valleys, each of which continued as a center of practice after he left. He fathered a son with his consort during this period, a son who became a lineage holder and carried the teachings forward in the next generation. He wrote, "In the midst of exile, and the practical demands of an itinerant teaching life. Some of the texts that would later be considered among his most essential work. He was, by every measure that the tradition would later apply, not diminished by what happened to him. He was deepened. He returned to Tibet in 1365. When the political situation had shifted and his return was permitted, he spent his final years at a retreat place called Gangri Tokar, the White Skull Snow Mountain, practicing in the high solitude that the later years of a Dzogchen master's life typically tend toward. The institutional teaching, giving way to the direct encounter with what all the teaching had been pointing toward. He died in 1364, at the age of 56, at Gangri Tokar. His attendants recorded that he instructed them to place offerings and leave him to rest. When they returned, they found him seated in what the tradition calls the Dharmakaya posture, upright. Still, the posture of someone who has arrived at the place they were always heading and found it, as it turns out, exactly as described. The primordial state of exhaustion. His biographer called it not exhaustion as depletion, exhaustion as completion, the complete spending of what needed to be spent, leaving nothing unresolved, nothing held back, nothing carried forward that was not already everything. The sky, fully itself. And as that image settles in you, the sky, fully itself. Regardless of what passes through it, let the breath be exactly what it is. Not deep, not deliberate. Just the breath, arriving and departing without condition. The way the sky receives clouds and releases them without holding. If there is something you have been waiting to resolve before you allow yourself to rest some cloud you have been insisting must clear before you can find the stillness beneath it, you can let the insistence go now. Just for this breath. The stillness is not behind the clouds. It is the sky that contains them. Let your shoulders fall. Let the backs of your hands be heavy against whatever they are resting on. Let the space behind your eyes be vast rather than confined. If you drift into sleep now, that is perfect. You do not need to stay awake to receive what these stories are carrying. Let the body choose. The next story returns to Korea to a master named Mangong, who on the last day of his life stood before his own reflection in a mirror and spoke to it with the tenderness and honesty you might offer someone you have known for a very long time, someone you are about to part from, someone whose company has been difficult and irreplaceable in equal measure. Let that carry you forward gently as your breath slows and the darkness behind your eyes deepens into rest. In the autumn of 1946, at a monastery called Sudaeksa in the Chungcheong Mountains of central Korea, a monastery that sat at the base of a long wooded ridge and that had been a center of Korean Buddhist practice for over 1,000 years. Its main hall rebuilt and rebuilt again across the centuries until the building itself had become a kind of accumulated record of all the hands that had cared for it. There was a monk named Mangong who was 75 years old, and who knew, with the particular certainty that comes not from prophecy, but from the simple honesty of paying attention to one's own body across many decades, that today was the last day he would be in it. He had known for some time that it was coming. The body gives notice in ways that are not always dramatic, not always the sudden announcement of a crisis, but sometimes the quieter and more sustained message of a system that is completing rather than failing, that is moving toward its conclusion with the same unhurried intention that a river moves toward the sea. Mangong had been a student of impermanence for 62 years. He had entered the Sangha as a 13-year-old boy who had been brought to the monastery at Cheonggyesa by circumstances that left him there alone. and he had spent the decades since in the particular company of people who make it their practice to notice what arises and what passes without making more of either than what it actually is. He knew the feel of completion when it arrived. He had been present at enough deaths, had sat with enough teachers and fellow monks and students in their final hours to recognize the quality of this particular tiredness as distinct from any tiredness that sleep would resolve. He rose before dawn, as he always did. He sat in meditation as he always did. He attended the morning chanting with the assembled monks, his voice joining the Pali and Korean syllables that the hall had been absorbing and releasing for longer than anyone alive could remember. The sound of the chanting rising and dispersing into the mountain air with the morning mist. After the morning meal, he performed the evening offering ceremony, not at evening, but in the morning, because he understood that he would not be present for the actual evening, and because the offering was something he wanted to do with care and without hurrying, which required doing it while he still had full command of his attention and his hands. And then he did something that no one who was present had seen him do before, and that none of them, in the years of recounting that followed, could entirely explain, except as the action of someone operating from a clarity that ordinary explanation does not quite reach. He went to the mirror. Mangong Wulmyeon had been born in 1871 in the province of South Chungcheong, the second son of a farming family whose name is not recorded in the accounts that have come down to us, which is itself a kind of teaching, that the family name of the man who would become one of the most important Korean Seon masters of the 20th century has been absorbed back into the anonymity from which all of us emerge. What is recorded is that he was brought to Cheonggyesa Temple at the age of 13. Under circumstances the sources describe only as the necessities of the time, and that the monk who received him there recognized something in the boy that warranted attention. He was given the name Mangong full space, or in some translations, complete emptiness, the name carrying both meanings simultaneously in the way that the best Buddhist names do, pointing in opposite directions toward the same thing. He studied, he practiced, and then, in the years when Korean Buddhism was organizing itself around a new generation of teachers, the generation following the great Kyong Ho, whose enlightenment at Donghaksa had set the Seon tradition back in motion. After a long period of institutional decline, he found his teacher. Kyong Ho recognized Mangong in the way that genuine teachers recognize genuine students, not by examination or formal assessment, but by the quality of encounter. The way that certain people, when they meet, immediately understand that they are going to have to take each other seriously. The teaching relationship between them was intense and not always comfortable. Gyeongheo was not a teacher who made practice feel reassuring. He had a quality of directness that left nowhere to hide. And he used this quality freely with Mangong, who had his own stubbornness and his own intelligence and who resisted, as anyone with genuine intelligence does, being told what to think. The breakthrough came during an exchange that has been preserved in the records of Gyeongheo's teaching dialogues. Mangong had been practicing with a hwadu, the Korean Seon form of koan, a question that the thinking mind cannot resolve and must therefore exhaust itself against until something beyond thinking becomes available, and had come to his teacher, convinced that he had achieved understanding. He expressed this conviction in the direct way of someone who has been waiting to be recognized. Gyeongheo listened. Then he asked a question. The question had the quality of all Gyeongheo's best questions. It appeared to be about something, and it was. But what it was about was not what it appeared to be about. And the gap between the surface and the depth of the question was exactly the size of what Mangong had not yet understood. Mangong's answer collapsed. He went back to practice. He came again. The exchange repeated, not the same words, but the same structure. The student arriving with what he believed was understanding, the teacher finding in a single question the place where the understanding had not gone all the way through. This happened many times. The records do not say how many times. They say only that when it finally resolved, when the bottom of the question gave way and what was beneath it was simply present. Without the mediation of understanding, Mangong sat with his teacher for a long time in silence afterward. And Gyeongheo did not say anything except, eventually, "Now you know what you knew before you knew anything." Mangong spent the remaining decades of his life teaching in the lineage of his teacher. He taught at Sudeksa and at other major temples, attracting students from across Korea, including, notably, several women bhikshunis, fully ordained nuns whom he accepted and taught without the condescension that marked many male teachers' relationship with female students in that era. His disciple Byofui became the first nun in Korean Buddhist history to receive full Dharma transmission, which was not a small thing in a tradition that had for centuries treated women's spiritual capacity as a subordinate question. Mangong taught that the Buddha nature does not have a gender, which is both a simple doctrinal statement and, in its application, a radical one. He left behind no written works. This was deliberate. He had seen in his teacher Gyeongheo what happened when writings accumulated around a name, how the writings could become the thing remembered rather than the understanding the writings were pointing toward, and he had decided that the transmission he was responsible for would go directly from mind to mind, without the intermediate layer of text. What has survived are the Dharma talks his students compiled from memory and notes, and the encountered dialogues, the exchanges between teacher and student that constitute the living record of Seon practice, and these are enough to understand something about the quality of his presence. He was, by the accounts of those who practiced with him, a teacher of enormous warmth and enormous precision qualities that do not always coexist, but that in his case occupied the same space without apparent contradiction. The warmth providing the environment in which precision could be received without damage. The precision ensuring that the warmth was not mere comfort, but something that actually helped. He could sit with a student in the full weight of what they were struggling with and offer neither reassurance nor dismissal, only presence. And a question, and the specific quality of attention that tells a student, "I am not going to rescue you from this, but I am going to stay here while you find your own way through." He had, by 1946, been doing this for 60 years. He had been in the Sangha for 62 years. He had sat in meditation halls in the full range of seasons that Korea offers, the hard winters of the mountain monasteries, where the cold comes through the walls in the hours before dawn and sits in the room with the practitioners, like a demanding additional presence. The bright springs when the forsythia comes out along the monastery walls, and the mind, emerging from winter retreat, experiences the familiar world with the slightly disoriented vividness of something returning from a great distance. The full summers and the long clear autumns. He had taught students who were young when he taught them and who were themselves old now and teaching their own students in his lineage. He was 75 years old. His body had the weathered solidity of a man who has spent decades in physical discipline and outdoor conditions and who has made no particular effort to protect himself from the passage of time, because the passage of time was, in the most fundamental sense, the subject he was studying. He moved slowly in the way of someone who has stopped hurrying, not because they are impaired, but because hurrying has revealed itself as unnecessary. He spoke with the economy of someone who has learned that most of what people say is repetition of what they have already said, and that the world does not suffer from the omission of the repetition. On this particular autumn morning, after the morning chanting and after the offering ceremony, he had performed with the care of someone who knows he is performing it for the last time. Mangong walked to the mirror in the room adjacent to the main hall. He stood before it for a moment. He looked at what was looking back at him. The face of a man of 75, the skin loosened from the bones in the way that the skin of very old people loosens. A loosening that is not decay, but something more like the relaxation of something that has been held taut for a long time and has finally been permitted to soften. The eyes still clear. The posture still, the posture of someone who has spent 60 years in meditation upright, not from effort, but from the deep structural reorganization that decades of sitting in stillness produces in the body. A rightness in the spine that does not require maintenance because it has become the body's default. He looked at this face, and he spoke to it. He said, "This guy Mangong, though we have shared our lot for these past 70-some years, today is the last day. You have worked hard and done well." The monks who were present, who had followed him at a respectful distance, aware that something was happening that deserved witness, heard these words. They recorded them. The words passed into the tradition of Mangong's lineage and were repeated by his students when they spoke of him and were written down by those students' students, and have come down to us in the form in which they arrived: simple, direct, complete. The words of someone who has looked at himself clearly and found, in the looking, neither condemnation nor sentimentality, but something that encompasses both and is larger than either. You have worked hard and done well. There is a quality in those words that deserves to be held for a moment, because it is easy to pass through them quickly, to hear them as a simple farewell without feeling what they actually contain. You have worked hard. This is not false modesty, and it is not pride. It is honest witness. Mangong had worked hard. 62 years in the Sangha is not a small thing. The practice of Seon is not a comfortable practice, the long retreats, the cold meditation halls, the years of sitting with a huadu that refuses to resolve, the grinding of the thinking mind against a question it cannot answer until something deeper than thinking becomes available. The responsibility of teaching students who are confused and in pain and looking to you for something you can point toward but cannot give them directly. All of this is hard work. Honest witness says so, and done well. Not perfectly, not without error, not without the moments of blindness and stubbornness and the particular failures that every human practitioner carries, the places where the teaching did not penetrate as deeply as it needed to. The students who came and were not quite received in the way they needed to be received. The years when something that should have been clear was not yet clear and practice was sustained by intention rather than by understanding. Every honest life contains these. The witness who says done well does not pretend they were not there. It simply says, and despite them, or including them, the work of the life was done with genuine effort and genuine intention. And this counts for something, and deserves to be acknowledged. This is the teaching Mangong was offering in that final moment before the mirror, not to the tradition he was leaving, not to the students who would continue his lineage, but to himself, to the face that had accompanied him for 75 years, through everything a life in that century in that country required of those who lived it. The colonial occupation, the restructuring of an entire tradition under conditions of suppression, the deaths of teachers and students, and the losses that accumulate across a long life, like the wear on the step of an often used threshold, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look down and see how much has been worn away and understand that this wearing is not damage but evidence of use, of love, of the 10,000 ordinary acts of presence that a life contains. He was offering to himself what most of us find extraordinarily difficult to offer to ourselves. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness implies something requiring forgiveness. And the witness before the mirror was not primarily a witness of failure. Not celebration. Celebration is a response to achievement and implies measurement. And the witness before the mirror was not measuring. Something prior to both of those. Something more like the quality of attention. A very good parent offers a child who has done their best with what they had, accurate, warm, without illusion and without diminishment. You worked hard. You did well. The question this story carries into the dark of wherever you are listening from is a gentle one. Not urgent, not accusatory, just present. The way Mangong's presence was present in that monastery for 6 decades. When did you last look at yourself the way he looked at himself in that mirror? Not critically, not with the inventory of failures and shortcomings that the mind is practiced at producing at 3 in the morning. Not with the performed positivity that is the opposite of that inventory and is equally false. But clearly, accurately, with the specific warmth of someone who has been paying honest attention and who says, in the language appropriate to what they actually see, you have worked hard. You have done well. Most of us carry the weight of our lives as though the weight itself were a sign of inadequacy, as though a lighter life would mean we had done something right and the heaviness is proof of something wrong. Mangong had carried weight for 75 years. He had carried the weight of the practice and the weight of the responsibility and the weight of the particular historical moment he had been given to live in. He stood before the mirror and did not apologize for the weight. He acknowledged it. He honored it. He named it with the simplicity that only very clear seeing makes possible. And then he was finished. He died that day. His disciples gathered around him and chanted the sutras and performed the ceremonies appropriate to the passage of a great teacher. The accounts say he died with the same quality that had characterized his teaching for 6 decades present. Unhurried, without performance. In the company of those who loved him and whom he had loved, with the specific and demanding love of a teacher who believes, genuinely and without reservation. In the capacity of the people in front of him, his lineage continues. His students are teaching now, in Korea and in countries beyond Korea. The Dharma transmissions he gave, including the one he gave to Byofwi, the first nun in Korean Buddhist history to receive it, branched and extended and continued, the way rivers extend from their sources without depleting them. And somewhere in that lineage, in the understanding transmitted from teacher to student, in the way that understanding moves when it is genuine, somewhere in all of that, the words before the mirror are still present. This guy Mangong, you have worked hard and done well. Let those words arrive in you now, not directed at Mangong, but as a permission. A permission to look at yourself with that same quality of honest, warm, accurate witness. Whatever you have carried today, whatever the weight of this particular life has asked of you in these recent days or months or years, you can acknowledge it now. Not apologize for it. Not explain it. Just acknowledge it. The way Mangong acknowledged 62 years of practice, as real, as substantial, as deserving of honest recognition. You have been here. You have been trying. In the ways available to you, in the circumstances given to you, with the understanding you have had at each moment of having it, you have been working. Let your body receive that acknowledgement now. Let the shoulders fall. Let the chest soften. Let the jaw release whatever it has been clenching since this morning. If you drift into sleep from here, let it be the sleep of someone who has been given permission to rest. Not because everything is resolved. Because the witness who has been watching you knows what honest work looks like and sees it in you. And says so. The next story moves us deeper into the night to a forest in Thailand where an elderly nun has lost most of her memories, but whose body still knows every step of the path to the shrine, still knows exactly how to bow, still carries in its very bones the practice of 50 years. A story about what cannot be taken by time. Let that carry you forward into the softening dark. In a forest monastery in the northeast of Thailand, in the province of Ubon Ratchathani, where the land is flat and red, and the forest, where it has been left to grow, reaches upward with a particular urgency, as though the trees understand they are surrounded by cleared fields and have decided to be as fully forest as possible in the space still available to them. There was a small community of Machi in forest nuns who had been practicing together for many years in a cluster of meditation huts set back from the main monastery path along a secondary track that wound through teak and rain trees and came out, eventually, at a small shrine beside a pond. The shrine was simple. A concrete platform, slightly raised, with a wooden roof on 4 posts that had been repaired so many times the repair work had become the structure. On the platform, a Buddha figure, old enough that the gilding had worn from the hands and the face into something that was not gold anymore, and was not the concrete beneath the gold, but a third thing, a color particular to objects that have been touched and looked at and prayed before across many decades. Something between amber and rust, the color of long use. Around the base of the figure, offerings, flowers that the nuns replaced each morning, incense sticks whose ash had built up across the years into a small ridge along the offering bowl. A cup of water changed each day. The path to the shrine from the cluster of meditation huts was approximately 200 steps. It wound between the trees, crossed a small wooden bridge over a seasonal stream that ran in the wet months and was dry red clay in the dry months, past a large teak tree whose roots had lifted one section of the path into a small ridge that everyone who used the path had long since internalized as simply part of the walking, and arrived at the clearing where the shrine sat beside the still water of the pond. It was a path that one of the nuns had walked every morning for 51 years. Her name in the world, the name her parents had given her in the farming village where she was born, had been Mali. In the monastery, she was known as Machi Kesson, Mother Sister Kesson, a name given to her when she first took the white robes of a Machi at the age of 22, leaving behind a life that had been arranged for her but had never quite fit. The way a garment cut for someone else's measurements sits wrong on the body regardless of its quality. She had come to the monastery in the year that Ajahn Chah was just beginning to build Wat Nong Pa Pong, in the early years when the forest community was still finding its form, and she had stayed for reasons that were at first simple: the practice, the stillness, the quality of the community, and that became, over time, reasons that could no longer be separated from what she was. She was 73 years old now, and something had been changing in her for the past 2 years. It had begun with small things. The name of a monk who had been visiting the monastery for decades, suddenly absent from her memory when she needed it. The sequence of the evening chanting, which she had performed 10,000 times, occasionally losing its thread partway through and requiring the support of the voices around her to find it again. The location of objects she had placed somewhere deliberate: her extra robe, her begging bowl stand, the small cloth bag in which she kept the supplies for her morning practice, occasionally not where she had put them, or not where she remembered putting them, which was not the same thing but felt the same. Then larger things, conversations she had no memory of having, the names of younger nuns who had been practicing beside her for years, surfaces of faces she knew completely and names that her mind now held only sometimes, at unpredictable intervals, in a way that felt like weather rather than like memory. Days that ran together without clear demarcation. The occasional confusion, in the hour before dawn, when she woke and the darkness was total, about where she was and what year it was and which chapter of her life she was inhabiting. The abbess of the Machi community, a woman named Machi Thongdi, who had been practicing at the monastery for 30 years and who had learned from Ajahn Chah's lineage the specific quality of attention that neither minimizes what is difficult nor amplifies it beyond what it actually is, watched this unfolding with the care and the honesty it deserved. She spoke with the monastery's doctor. She spoke with Machi Kesson herself. On the good days when Kesson was entirely present and could speak plainly about what she was experiencing, she made arrangements to ensure that the elder nun was never alone in ways that involved risk, while preserving as much of her ordinary routine as the situation permitted. Because what Machi Thongdi had observed, and what the younger nuns in the community, watching with the attention of people who love someone and are paying close attention to what love requires in new circumstances, what they had all observed was something that complicated the simple narrative of loss. Machi Kesson's memory was thinning. The layer of personal history and accumulated narrative that most of us experience as the substance of self, the web of names and dates and sequences and stories that we use to locate ourselves in time and relation. This layer was becoming more transparent, more permeable, less reliably present. But the practice was not thinning. Every morning, regardless of what the night had held, regardless of whether the pre-dawn hour had found her confused or clear, regardless of whether she remembered the name of the nun who helped her dress or could not in that moment recall it, Machi Kesson rose and walked to the shrine. She did not always remember walking. She did not always remember, by the time she reached the pond, the sequence of thoughts or the series of steps that had brought her there. But she was there. She had walked the path between the huts and the shrine without incident, without guidance, without assistance, her feet knowing the slight ridge where the teak root lifted the path, her body knowing the angle of the bridge, her hands knowing the rail, her whole system moving through the 200 steps with the unhurried certainty of something that has done this so many times that doing it has passed below the threshold of decision and become simply what the body does when it wakes, and the sky is still dark and the monastery is quiet. She arrived at the shrine. She stood before the figure with the worn gilding, and she bowed. The bow was not tentative. It was not the bow of someone performing a remembered action. It was the bow of someone for whom bowing in this particular way, before this particular figure, was as natural as breathing, the hands coming together at the heart, the body inclining from the hips with a precision and a depth that 51 years of daily practice had written into muscle and bone so thoroughly that the notation did not require the reading mind to access it. The bow knew itself. The body knew the bow. She knelt. She placed the fresh flowers she had brought from the garden. She changed the water in the offering cup with the deliberate care of someone who understands that the gesture of changing the water is as important as the water itself, not important as a performance of importance, but important in the way that any honest act of attention to what is sacred is important, because the attention is real. Because the love behind the attention is real. And because real love expressed in repeated small acts over 50 years becomes indistinguishable from the person expressing it. She lit the incense. She held it for a moment between her palms in the posture of offering. And then she chanted. What she chanted were the Pali verses of homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, the verses that every Theravada Buddhist practitioner learns early in their practice, and that most practitioners have said hundreds of thousands of times across a long practice life. The Pali syllables moved through her like water moves through a channel, worn smooth by water without resistance, without effort, without the intervention of will. Her voice was the voice of an old woman, thin in the upper registers and warmer in the lower ones, and it carried the verses into the morning air with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the state of her memory and everything to do with the state of her practice. Machi Thongdi watched this happen on many mornings from a respectful distance. She watched it and thought about it, and eventually spoke about it to one of the younger nuns who had come to her with the question that the younger nun had been holding for weeks. The younger nun, her name was Pim. She had been at the monastery for 3 years. She was 26 years old and possessed of the particular combination of intelligence and uncertainty that makes someone either a very good practitioner or a very troubled one. Depending on what they do with it, Pim had come to Machi Thongdi and said, "I don't understand what I'm seeing. Machi Kesson doesn't remember my name half the time. She doesn't always know what day it is. She sometimes doesn't remember that we had a conversation an hour ago. But she goes to the shrine every morning, and she bows and she chants, and she arranges the flowers with the same care she has always used. How is it possible that the practice is still there when so much else isn't?" Machi Thongdi was quiet for a moment. They were sitting in the shade of the large teak tree at the bend in the path, and the morning light was coming through the canopy in the particular broken way of morning light in a forest, pooling in one place and absent from another in a pattern that changed as the leaves moved. "What do you think you are?" Machi Thongdi asked. Pim was uncertain what the question was asking. "I'm a person, a practitioner. I have." Machi Thongdi waited. "I have memories," Pim said. "Thoughts. A history. I know my own name. I know the names of the people around me. I know what year it is and what I did yesterday." "Yes," Machi Thongdi said. "And Machi Kesson knows some of those things and not others, and the ones she doesn't know change from day to day. So by the measure you're using, she is less of a person than she was, less of a practitioner." Pim was uncomfortable. "No, that's not what I..." "What if those things," Machi Thongdi said gently, "are not what you are? What if they are what you know about yourself? And what if knowing about yourself and being yourself are two different things that we have spent our entire lives assuming are the same thing?" Pim sat with this. "What you're seeing in Machi Kesson," Machi Thongdi said, "is what 50 years of practice actually does. Not what it does to your ability to remember. Not what it does to your ability to narrate your own life, to yourself. What it does to the body, to the capacity for attention, to the orientation of the whole system toward what is sacred. These things don't live in the memory. They live somewhere deeper than memory. And when the memory thins, they don't go with it. They're still there, holding the posture, walking the path, arranging the flowers. Still entirely, completely there." Pim looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the broken light in the canopy above them. "Then what is memory?" she asked. "If it's not what we are, it's the story we tell about what we are." Machi Thongdi said, "It's useful. It helps us navigate. It helps us care for each other, remember each other's names, show up for the things we have committed to showing up for. It is not unimportant, but it is the map, not the territory. And Machi Kesson has lost some of the map. The territory is still there. The territory was always there, before the map was drawn, and it will be there when the map is gone. There was an afternoon, in the cool season, when the light in Ubon Ratchathani takes on a clarity it does not have in the hot months, a crystalline, slightly lateral quality, as if the sun has decided to illuminate things from the side rather than from above. When Machi Kesson sat beside the pond after her morning practice and did not return to her hut, she sat for a long time. The pond was still. The reflection of the sky in the water was as complete as the sky above it, the same clouds, the same particular blue, the same quality of afternoon stillness, reproduced in the water with a fidelity that made it difficult, from certain angles, to tell which was the original and which was the reflection. Pim found her there in the late afternoon and sat beside her without speaking. They sat together in the way that people sometimes sit together when speaking is not the point. After a while, Machi Kesson said not to Pim, exactly, but into the air of the afternoon. In the way of someone thinking aloud without requiring an audience, she said, "The water doesn't try to hold the sky." Pim looked at the pond, at the sky reflected in it, at the way a single leaf drifting across the surface passed through the reflected clouds without disturbing them in any way that lasted. "No," Pim said softly. "It just receives it." Machi Kesson was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "I used to think I was the water. Now I think I might be more like the receiving." Pim did not fully understand this. She thought about it for many years afterward, through her own deepening practice and eventually through her own teaching. She came back to it when students asked her questions about the self. She came back to it in her own sitting, in the hours before dawn, when the monastery was quiet and the mind had not yet organized itself into the familiar shape of its daily concerns. She came to understand it not as a statement about memory or about aging specifically, but as a description of what practice points toward from the beginning, the recognition that the consciousness which receives experience, which holds the sky, which knows the bow, which walks the path, which arranges the flowers with 50 years of love in its hands, this consciousness is not built from its contents. It is prior to its contents. It is what was there before the first memory was formed, and it is what remains when memories thin, not diminished, not confused, not lost, simply more visible. The way a window becomes more visible when the room on the other side of it is very well lit. Machi Kesson practiced for 4 more years after that afternoon beside the pond. Her memory continued to thin. The names continued to come and go with the unpredictability of weather. The sequence of the chanting required more support from the voices around her as time went on. But every morning, in the hour before dawn, when the monastery was quiet and the sky above the forest had begun its long, slow lightening from black to the deep blue that precedes grey, she rose and walked the path to the shrine. Her feet knew the ridge where the teak root lifted the ground. Her hands knew the rail of the small bridge. Her body knew the bow, and the bow knew her body. And between them, they carried 51 years of practice to the worn gilt figure at the edge of the still water and offered it, every morning, with the care of someone for whom care has become not a decision, but the ground on which all decisions rest. The water doesn't try to hold the sky. It just receives it. You are the receiving. Let that land in whatever way it can, without needing to be understood completely. Some things are received by the body before they are understood by the mind. Let the body receive this. Notice, if you like, that the awareness that is present in you right now, the quiet knowing that is reading these words or hearing these words or simply present in the dark of this room, does not require your name to function, does not require your history, does not require the list of what you have done or left undone. It is simply here, receiving, the way the pond receives the sky. Let your face soften. Let the forehead release. Let the space behind the eyes be wide and receptive rather than focused and effortful. You don't need to stay awake to receive what remains. Let the body choose its moment. The next story takes us to the ancient city of Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, to an old craftsman who has been carving the same Buddha figure for 40 years, and who one morning discovers that what has been changing across all that time is not what he thought, and what has remained constant is not what he expected. Let the breath carry you there slowly. Let the darkness be restful. Let the receiving continue without effort. In the ancient city of Anuradhapura in the northern plains of Sri Lanka, a city that had been a center of Buddhist civilization for more than 2,000 years before the craftsman who concerns us was born. A city whose great white dagobas rose from the flat plain like arrested thought, like the mind's understanding of itself made permanent in stone and lime plaster. Visible from miles away across the surrounding forest, and the rice paddies and the long straight roads built by kings who had long since returned to dust, there was a man named Nandadasa who carved stone. He had been carving stone for 40 years. He had learned the craft from his father, who had learned it from his father. In the way that certain knowledges move through families, like a particular quality of light moves through different vessels, changed in color by each new container, but continuous in its essential nature, recognizable across generations to anyone who knows what to look for. The knowledge was specific and embodied, how to read the grain of the limestone before striking it, how to understand from the sound of the chisel on the surface whether the stone beneath is sound or hollow, how to move the wrist at the precise angle that allows the tool to remove exactly what needs to be removed and nothing more, how to feel the figure that is already inside the stone and let the carving be the gradual removal of what is obscuring it rather than the imposition of a form from outside. His father had taught him this last part with particular emphasis. The figure is already there. His father had said, "Your job is only to find where it is and remove what is hiding it. The stone knows what it wants to become. You are only helping it get there." Nandadasa had been carving Buddha figures for 40 years. Not exclusively, there had been years when commissions for temple guardians or decorative panels for wealthy households had sustained the workshop through the dry seasons when temple commissions were fewer, but the Buddha, the figure, had been the center of his craft's gravity from the beginning. The form he returned to, the form that measured his understanding of what his hands knew at any given point in his life. The form against which everything else was tested. He was 67 years old now. He worked in a workshop open on 3 sides to the air, attached to the back of his family's house in the old quarter of Anuradhapura, where the streets were narrow and the trees grew close to the walls and the sound of temple bells carried from several directions in the early morning, overlapping at certain moments into something that was not quite music and not quite speech, but that contained qualities of both. His wife, Chandrani, brought him tea at the beginning of the morning work and again at midday. His son Pradeep, who had learned some of the craft and who managed the business arrangements that Nandadasa had always found more tedious than the work itself, came and went with commissions and conversations about delivery timelines and the specific requirements of this or that temple committee. His grandchildren, 3 of them, used the workshop occasionally as a place to play when the house was too small for their energy, which it often was. And Nandadasa did not object to this, because he had discovered long ago that the presence of children in the workshop did not disturb the work and occasionally improved it, their questions having a quality of directness that kept the work honest. On the morning that concerns us, a morning in the cool season, when the air in Anuradhapura had the particular clarity of cool season mornings in the dry zone, a crispness that does not last past 9 o'clock, but that in the early hours makes everything visible in a way that slightly resembles the atmosphere of a dream. Every edge precise, every color slightly more itself than usual. Nandadasa arrived at the workshop before dawn and stood for a long time looking at the piece he had been working on for 3 months. It was a seated Buddha figure, approximately half life-size, commissioned by a temple in the southern province whose abbot had traveled to Anuradhapura specifically to engage Nandadasa for the work, after seeing an earlier piece at another temple and recognizing in it something he could not entirely articulate, but which he described in his letter of commission as the quality of stillness that does not require stillness to be present. Nandadasa had thought about this phrase for weeks before beginning the work. He had thought about it the way he thought about the grain of a new stone, turning it slowly in the light, looking for what it was telling him, waiting until he understood it well enough to begin. The quality of stillness that does not require stillness to be present. He had been in the craft for 40 years, and he had heard many things said about Buddha figures, and most of them were true in their way: the proportions, the iconographic requirements, the specific details of hand position and facial expression, and the treatment of the robe that distinguished one tradition from another. The technical matters of how limestone behaves differently from granite, and how the air in the north of the island and the air in the south affect the curing of the lime plaster used for the final surface of the figure's skin. All of this he knew. He had known most of it for 20 years. But what the abbot's phrase pointed toward was not technical knowledge. It was something that Nandadasa had been approaching across 40 years of work. The way you approach a particular quality of light, not by walking directly toward it, because it tends to move when you do, but by orienting yourself in the right general direction and allowing the approach to happen at the pace the light itself permits. He had made his first Buddha figure at 27. He could still see it clearly in his memory: the uncertainty in the hands, the slight stiffness in the facial expression that comes from trying too hard to make the expression correct rather than allowing it to find its own rightness. The quality of effortfulness that marks the work of someone who knows what they are aiming for but does not yet trust the aim. The figure had been bought by a small temple in the countryside and was presumably still there. And Nandadasa thought about it occasionally with the particular feeling one has about early work, a combination of tenderness and a kind of retrospective understanding that was not available at the time. He had made figures at 35 and 42 and 51, and at various ages between 48. And the work had changed in ways that were easier to see from the outside than to describe from the inside. Other craftsmen who knew his work across the decades spoke about this change in terms of refinement, the figures becoming simpler, the details becoming fewer but more essential, the quality of presence in the face becoming somehow more available, less mediated by the apparatus of craft. His son Pradeep, who had a good eye despite not having his father's hands, said once that the newer figures looked as though they were breathing. Nandadasa had received this observation without comment because he did not know what to add to it. What he knew, from the inside of the work, was that something had changed in the nature of the effort involved. The early work had required him to hold the figure in his mind and impose it on the stone. The later work, and this had happened gradually, so gradually that he could not have said when it changed. Only that at some point it had the later work felt more like listening, more like removing what was in the way of what was already present. His father's phrase, which had seemed like poetry when he first heard it, had gradually revealed itself as precise description. The figure is already there. Your job is only to find it. He stood in the pre-dawn quiet, looking at the commission piece and thinking, or not quite thinking, doing what happens in the space between thinking and something less structured than thinking about 40 years of the same essential work. The monastery of Abhayagiri, whose ruins stood at the northern edge of ancient Anuradhapura, 2,000 years of history compressed into the remaining stone platforms, and the great dagoba that even in ruin was one of the largest structures in the ancient world, had been, in its centuries of operation, a center of learning and practice in the Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka. Monks had come from as far as China and India to study there. The texts produced in its scriptoriums had shaped the course of Buddhist philosophy across Asia. And in its workshops, craftsmen had produced the sacred figures that populated the shrines and meditation halls of the surrounding monasteries and temples. Craftsmen who worked in the understanding that what they were making was not decorative but functional, that the figure in stone or bronze or wood was a support for practice, a physical anchor for the mind's recognition of what Buddha nature pointed toward, a way of making visible something that could not be made visible directly but could be approached through the skillful use of form. Nandadasa knew this history. He had grown up in its shadow literally. Since the great dagoba of Abhayagiri was visible from the roof of his family's house, and he had understood from the beginning that the tradition of craft he had entered was not primarily an aesthetic tradition, but a contemplative one. The measure of a figure was not whether it was beautiful, though beauty was part of it. The measure was whether it supported the opening that the practice was trying to create. He had spent 40 years trying to understand what that meant technically, in terms of proportion and material and the specific qualities of surface that the eye encountered in a particular quality of light. And he had arrived, in his 67th year, at the understanding that the technical knowledge was not separable from something else, something that the technical knowledge had been building toward across 4 decades without his fully realizing it. The way a path you have been walking for a long time is building toward a view that you cannot see from any earlier point on the path, but that has been the destination the whole time. The something else was this. The figure that the work was approaching across all those years was not a figure in stone. The stone figure was pointing at something that had no stone, no material form, no weight, no surface that could be touched or measured or refined. The stillness the abbot had tried to describe the quality of stillness that does not require stillness to be present. This was not in the stone. The stone could carry it, could point toward it, could create the conditions in which a practitioner sitting before it might have access to it. But it was not in the stone. It was in what the stone was trying to show. What the stone was trying to show was what Nandadasa had been slowly, across 40 years, learning to recognize in himself. The awareness that was present before he picked up the chisel and that was present after he set it down. The quality of knowing that did not change when the figure changed. The stillness that accompanied the work from beginning to end, not the stillness of a finished object, but the stillness of the consciousness doing the work, which was the same in the first uncertain stroke at 27, as in the most refined and confident stroke at 67. He had been carving the same thing all along. Not the same figure, each figure was different. Each commission brought its specific requirements. Each stone had its specific grain and its specific way of receiving the chisel. But the same essential act, the act of removing what was obscuring what was already there, the act of listening to what the material was telling him, the act of allowing the form to arrive rather than imposing it. This was not only a description of carving. He understood that, now with a clarity that 40 years had been building toward. A clarity that felt not like an arrival but like a recognition, as if he had been in a particular room all his life and had only just noticed that the room had a window. And through the window, was a landscape that explained everything about the room's dimensions and orientation. He picked up his chisel. He stood before the seated figure, the figure whose face was nearly done, whose hands were nearly at the position the iconography required, whose robe fell in the specific way that distinguished this tradition from others. He looked at the face. The face had something in it that he had been approaching for 3 months, and that was almost there, and that he had learned, across 40 years, not to rush. The quality the abbot had described. The stillness that does not require stillness to be present. He understood now that he could not put it there with the chisel. The chisel could only remove what was preventing it from being visible. The quality itself was already present, had been present in the stone from the beginning, in the way that everything the stone was capable of becoming was present in it from the moment it was quarried. His 40 years of craft had been the gradual development of the capacity to see it and the skill to uncover it. And the two, the seeing and the uncovering, were not really two different things. He began to work. The sound of the chisel on the stone was the sound it had always been, a specific, clean, slightly ringing contact between one hard thing and another. The sound of precision meeting resistance and winning gently, not by force, but by angle and patience. The chips of limestone fell to the workshop floor with the soft sound of small, inevitable things releasing themselves. The morning light moved, as mornings do, from the horizontal gold of dawn through the rising clarity of the hours after. Chandrani brought tea. He drank it without putting down the chisel, which was a habit she had long since stopped commenting on. Pradeep came with a question about the delivery timeline for a different commission. Nandadasa answered it without looking up. The grandchildren arrived at some point in the morning and sat in the corner of the workshop with something they were building from scraps of wood. And the quiet sounds of their building were part of the workshop's ambient life, in the way that bird sound is part of a forest's ambient life present. Appropriate, not requiring attention. And the figure in the stone continued its emergence. The face continued its slow arrival at the quality the abbot had tried to describe and that Nandadasa had spent 3 months and 40 years approaching. The stillness that does not require stillness. The presence that is not interrupted by what passes through it. The awareness that holds the chisel and holds the stone and holds the morning and holds the sound of children building something in the corner and does not need any of these things to be different in order to be completely what it is. By the middle of the afternoon, the face was done. Nandadasa stood back. He looked at what the stone had become. He looked at it for a long time, in the way he always looked at finished work, not with pride, exactly, and not with the critical assessment of someone looking for what should have been done differently. With the specific quality of attention that you bring to something that has been accomplished through a long collaboration between your hands and your understanding and a piece of stone that had, all along, known what it was. His son came to the workshop doorway and looked. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said what he had said before about Nandadasa's best work. It looks like it's breathing. Nandadasa looked at the face, at the quality of stillness in it that the stone was carrying without strain, the way a pond carries the sky, not holding it, not trying to contain it, simply receiving it and making it visible to anyone who comes to look. Yes, he said. It does. He set down the chisel. He stood for a moment in the late afternoon light of the workshop, with the limestone dust on his hands and the small ridge of chips at his feet and the grandchildren still building something in the corner and the tea his wife had brought growing cold on the shelf beside him. He had been doing this for 40 years. He would do it for however many years remained. Each figure would be different. Each stone would have its own grain and its own way of receiving the work. And the work would be the same essential work it had always been, the patient, attentive removal of what was preventing what was already there from being seen. This is what the 40 years had taught him. Not a technique, a way of attending, a quality of presence that the presence of the work had slowly, like the chisel on the stone, uncovered in him, removing what was in the way, returning again and again to what was already there. He swept the workshop. He covered the figure with cloth to keep the dust from the surface overnight. He walked through the workshop door into the late afternoon of Anuradhapura, where the great dagoba rose above the trees at the end of the road, and the temple bells were beginning their evening conversation with the cooling air. And he went inside to wash the limestone from his hands before the evening meal. The figure stood in the covered workshop. The stillness in its face did not require the dark to be present. It was simply there, as it had always been, as it would be in the morning when the cloth was lifted and the work continued, and the light came again through the open walls of the workshop and found what the stone, over 40 years, and the long collaboration of a craftsman's understanding, had been slowly and patiently and completely becoming. Let the breath be slow now. Let it arrive without being invited and depart without being held. What has been carving you? Across all the years of your life, all the difficulty and the love and the loss and the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones has been removing, stroke by patient stroke, what was in the way of what you already are. You are not the chips on the floor. You are not what has been removed. You are what has been there the whole time, underneath the removing. Let the body be heavy. Let the mind be soft. Let the space behind the eyes be as wide and as patient as the sky above a stone figure in a closed workshop, waiting for morning. If sleep comes now, let it come. You don't need to be awake for what follows. The next story does not require your attention. It only requires your rest. We go now to Japan one final time to a winter night in Echigo, to the small room where Ryokan was held by Teishin in his last hours, to the autumn leaf that shows both its sides as it falls, to the moon that no one could steal and that shines on this room, on your face, on the breath rising and falling in the dark. Let go. Let the body be held. Let the night do its work. The snow had been falling since late afternoon. Not heavily. Not with the urgency of a storm that intends to change things. Just the quiet, patient snowfall that comes to the snow country of Echigo. In the deep of January, small dry flakes that arrive without announcement and settle without fuss on the roof tiles and the garden stones and the bare branches of the plum tree that Ryokan had been looking at through the window for 3 winters now. He had not left the room for several weeks, not because he had been told to stay, not because of a particular decision made on a particular morning, simply because the room had become, by degrees so gradual they were barely noticeable from the inside, the right size for what remained of his energy. The futon, the low table with the inkstone and the brushes and the stack of paper that Teishin refreshed whenever it ran low. The small brazier whose warmth was sufficient for a room of this size and for a body that had learned, over 72 years, to require less than it once had. The window, through which the plum tree was visible, and beyond the plum tree, the small section of garden that Kimura's household maintained, and beyond the garden, the grey-white sky of an Echigo winter. This was the world now. And it was enough. It was, in the way that very simple things are, sometimes enough, The way a single bowl of rice is enough, when hunger is honest and the rice is good, more than enough. Taishin had been staying at the house for the past several days. She had her own room, which she used for sleeping and for the practice. She continued with the discipline of someone who has understood that practice is not what you do when conditions are favorable, but what you do regardless of what the conditions are doing. But she spent most of the daylight hours in Ryokan's room sitting with him, reading her own work aloud when he asked, writing when he dictated a line or two that had arrived in him and needed to be placed somewhere outside his mind before it dispersed. Sitting in silence when silence was what the room required. She was 30 years old. He was 72. The 40-year difference had never seemed, to either of them, like the primary fact about their friendship. The primary fact, from the beginning, had been the quality of mutual recognition, the sense of encountering someone who lived in the same country that you yourself inhabited, and who therefore did not require explanation for the things that required explanation everywhere else. On this particular evening, after the small evening meal that Ryokan had eaten, very little of a few spoonfuls of the rice porridge that Kimura's wife prepared each night now, soft enough to require no effort, warm enough to be felt all the way down after the evening meal. The room had grown quiet, in the specific way of rooms where someone is resting but not asleep. The brazier clicked softly. The snow continued at the window, visible as a quality of light rather than as individual flakes, the particular dimness of a snow sky at night. The way the white ground below reflects enough light upward to make the darkness above it softer than ordinary dark. Ryokan was lying on the futon with a thin blanket across his shoulders. His face had the quality that very old faces sometimes have in low light, the architecture of the bones more visible than usual. The skin resting against the structure beneath it, with a closeness that was not gauntness, but something else. Something like the closeness of water to the vessel that holds it when the vessel has been long in use. Taishin was sitting beside the futon, not doing anything in particular, not reading, not writing, not preparing for conversation, simply present in the way she had learned to be present, not filling the space with the performance of presence, but simply being in it, available, the way a lamp is available without making effort about its availability. After a while, Ryokan's hand moved. It moved from beneath the blanket in the slow, a deliberate way of a body that is conserving what it has and spending it thoughtfully, and it came to rest on the edge of the futon nearest to where Taishin was sitting. She placed her hand over it. The room was very quiet. The brazier, the snow. Ryokan's eyes were open, looking at the ceiling or at something beyond the ceiling, not with the focused gaze of someone examining a thing, but with the relaxed, unfocused gaze of someone resting their eyes on a surface without particularly needing the surface to be anything. He said, without turning his head, "Is the moon up?" Taishin looked toward the window. The snow sky gave back its soft reflected light, and somewhere above the clouds, the moon was where it always was, doing what it always did, shining on whatever was below it without preference, without requiring clear sky to be present, without diminishing because clouds had come between it and the ground. "It's cloudy," she said. "But yes, it must be up." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the same tone he might have used to note that the tea had gone cold, "I am glad you are here." She did not say anything. She held his hand and was glad that she was there, and did not say this because it was not the kind of thing that needed to be said between people who are already inside it. He had given her the poem that morning. He had asked for the brushes and the paper, and she had set them up for him on the low table and had helped him sit upright. And he had held the brush in the hand that still held it with some steadiness, and he had written 4 lines. The poem spoke of an autumn leaf, a single leaf on a single branch. Toward the end of autumn, when most of the other leaves have already gone, and this one has remained through the first cold mornings, through the occasional early snow that comes before the real snow, through the long grey afternoons of a mountain autumn. The leaf shows one side and then the other as the wind moves it, and then it falls. It falls, showing first one side and then the other. Visible in its entirety, only in the falling, the hidden side and the revealed side both present, both equally the leaf, the falling itself being the condition under which the leaf is finally, completely seen. He had given her the poem without saying what it meant. He had not said, "This is about dying." He had not said, "This is my last poem." He had simply written it and given it to her, and she had read it and folded it carefully and placed it inside her robe against her heart, which is where she kept it for the rest of her life. Later in the evening, after the house had grown quiet around them and the snow had stopped and the cold had deepened in the particular way of winter nights in the snow country, when the clouds clear and the stars appear and the temperature falls with a speed that makes the cold feel intentional, like a presence that has been waiting just outside the door later in the evening. Ryokan's breathing changed. Not dramatically. Not with any of the distress that breathing sometimes carries when it changes. Just a gradual deepening, a gradual slowing, a gradual lengthening of the space between the breath in and the breath out that was not alarming because it was not effortful. It was the breath of someone resting more deeply than usual. The breath of someone whose body was doing, without consultation, what it knew it was time to do. Tae-shin held his hand. She did not move. She did not call anyone. She stayed where she was, present, her own breathing quieting to match something in the room, not matching his breath exactly, not performing anything, just settling into the same quality of stillness that the room itself had settled into. The brazier burned low. The stars, through the cleared window, were the winter stars of Echigo Orion tilted over the western ridge. The Pleiades high and cold, the particular brightness of winter stars that comes from the air being so dry and cold that nothing intervenes between the eye and the light. Ryokan breathed. The space between the breaths lengthened. The moon came out from behind the remaining clouds. Its light came through the window and lay across the room in the way that moonlight lays across rooms, not the assertive light of lamps, not the demanding light of morning, but the quiet and entirely sufficient light of something that does not need the room to look any particular way and simply illuminates what is there. It lay across the low table with the inkstone and the brushes. It lay across the paper on which the poem had been written and then given away. It lay across the futon and the thin blanket and the face that had written 10,000 poems about this moon, and that was now receiving its light with the same uncomplicated openness with which a pond receives the sky. Tae-shin held his hand. The moon was up. She recorded later that he died just as if he were falling asleep, not as a consolation, not as the polished language of biography that smooths the actual texture of things into something more presentable, as a simple description of what she witnessed, the breathing, which had been growing quieter and slower and further apart, becoming at some point indistinguishable from the silence around it, and then the silence simply being the silence. With no boundary she could locate between the last breath and the first moment of its absence, just as if he were falling asleep. She sat with him for a while after. She did not immediately rise and call the household. She sat with him the way she had always sat with him, present, not requiring anything of the situation except that she be in it honestly, and the moonlight continued in the room, and the winter stars continued in the window, and the cold outside the walls was the cold it had always been. Entirely indifferent and entirely appropriate. The thief left it behind. He had written once, long ago in the hut on the mountain, "The moon at my window, the poem no one could steal, the light that had shone on the empty doorway and the retreating back of the thief, and that was shining now on this room, on this face, on this hand that she was still holding, on the paper where the poem about the autumn leaf had been written that morning." She had understood something when she read that poem, holding it against her heart. She understood it more fully now. In the room that the moonlight was quietly, completely filling, the leaf shows both its sides in the falling, the hidden and the revealed, the side that was always visible and the side that was visible only when the leaf turned, both of them. The leaf, both of them equally true. The falling itself being the condition that makes the complete truth available. She understood that she had been given something, not the poem, though the poem was part of it. The something was larger than the poem and older than the poem, and had been present in every afternoon they had spent at the low table reading each other's work. In every winter morning when the snow fell on the garden outside the window, in every exchange of haiku across the months and years of their friendship, in every silence that they had inhabited together without filling it. What she had been given was not a teaching, and it was not a relationship, and it was not even a life's worth of poems, though it contained all of these things. What she had been given was the experience of being seen completely and found sufficient, not perfect, not extraordinary, not selected from among many for her particular qualities of mind or spirit, though those qualities had been recognized and appreciated and returned to her in the poems he wrote in response to hers. Simply seen, in the full and honest way that very few people in any life are seen by very few other people. The seeing that does not require you to be more than you are or to conceal what you are less than. The seeing that looks at the whole leaf, both sides, the hidden and the revealed, and finds it as it is, entirely itself and entirely enough. She sat with him until the moon had moved past the window and the room had returned to the quiet dark of deep winter night. Then she rose. She covered him carefully with the thin blanket. She bowed, once, in the way that she had bowed before every figure in every shrine she had ever visited, with her whole body and her whole attention and the complete weight of whatever she understood about what bowing was for. And then she went to find the household and tell them what had happened. The snow began again toward morning. Small dry flakes, arriving without announcement, settling without fuss on the roof tiles and the garden stones and the bare branches of the plum tree outside the window of the room where Ryokan was no longer. The moon had set. The stars, one by one, they were going out as the sky lightened, not disappearing, the way things disappear when they are lost, but withdrawing, the way things withdraw when the light has changed and they are no longer needed in their visible form. Having done what they were present to do, the snow fell on Echigo, on the monastery in the forest where Ryokan had lived for 36 years, on the path from Goguan down the mountain to the village where he had begged his rice and played with the children, on the fields where the villagers who had known him for decades were beginning, in the slow grey light of morning, to move toward the beginning of another day, on the window of the room where Teishin sat writing, because she had gone back to writing before the household was fully awake, because writing was what she did, and because there were things that the night had held that she wanted to place somewhere outside her mind before they dispersed. On everything, equally, the way the moon shines on everything, the way awareness receives everything, the way silence holds everything without effort, without preference, without requiring any of it to be different from what it is. The snow fell. The breath comes. The breath goes. There is a space between them that has no name and requires none. A space that is not empty, but that contains, without effort, everything that has ever been placed in it, every teaching, every story, every winter night, every autumn leaf showing both its sides as it falls, every moon reflected in every still pond, every hand held in the dark, every bow before every worn, gilded figure, every character drawn in the snow by an old man who was not a master anymore and was something more than a master. Every stone face emerging slowly from its material toward the stillness that was always inside it. All of it is here. All of it is resting in the same silence you are resting in right now. You don't need to hold any of it. It will hold itself. It always has. The snow falls. You are held. Let go. Tonight we have traveled through 6 traditions: the Thai Forest, Japanese Soto Zen, Korean Seon, Vietnamese Thiền Trúc Lâm, Tibetan Nyingma Dzogchen, and the ancient Theravada of Sri Lanka, and through the lives of masters who aged not despite their practice but through it, who found in the very process of losing strength, losing status, losing memory, losing the structures that had organized their lives, something that could not be lost. Not a consolation, not the compensation that grief sometimes offers. Something prior to consolation, something that was present before any of it began, and that was simply more visible at the end. The way a window is more visible when the room on the other side of it is very well lit. The teaching that ran through all of these lives, through the forest of Ubon Ratchathani, and the snow country of Echigo, and the mountains of Korea, and the ridges of Yen-tu, and the high retreat places of Tibet, and the limestone. A workshop of Anuradhapura was not complicated. It was the same teaching in different languages, in different bodies, in different weathers. It said, what you actually are was not located in any of the things that changed. It was here before them. It is here after them. It is here now, in this breath, in this darkness, in this body at rest. You don't need to understand this fully for it to be true. You don't need to remember it in the morning. Let it do its work in the dark, the way all the deepest work is done without supervision, without effort, without needing to be watched. I have been sitting with these particular masters for a long time, longer than I expected when I first began finding their stories. Something about the way they faced the end of their lives without drama and without denial, with the specific kind of honesty that only comes from having practiced honestly for a very long time, kept asking me to look more closely. Tonight, I finally found the way to share them with you, and I'm glad I waited until I did. If something in these stories touched where you needed to be touched tonight, if one image, one exchange, one quality of stillness found its way into you, then this time was well spent. And if you were asleep for most of it, that is also exactly right. The wisdom was here. You were here. That is enough. If this kind of company helps you rest, please consider leaving a like or sharing this with someone who might need it tonight. Not for the numbers, because someone you know might be lying awake in their own dark, carrying their own particular weight, and they deserve to know this is here. You are not behind. You have not missed anything. The life you are in this moment, with this breath, In this body that has carried you this far, it is not the waiting room for the life you meant to live. It is the life. Rest now. Rest completely. You have done enough for today. You are enough. Exactly as you are. Exactly here. Exactly in this. Good night.